system. But you could also say that this was really when the post-war period ended. The transition was heavily driven by politics. It raised questions about what would be the place of the United States in this new order. And the political and geopolitical consequences have been very, very large. So what was the post-war world? How did it look? Well, to oversimplify, it looks something like this. First world, second world, third world. Ironically, post-Ukraine war, we may be going back to something like this in many respects. How did this come about? Well, of course, the US helped rebuild Europe and Japan, Marshall Plan, et cetera. The Iron Curtain came down, Mao Zedong and the communists took over in China. Very importantly, the Western empires, in whatever state they remained in the middle of the 20th century, came apart pretty decisively. The imperial powers in Europe turned to domestic priorities. In that setting, the US and the Soviet Union vied for influence in these former colonies. The Soviet bloc economically was pretty much autonomous. There were some relationships, but they were episodic. The international monetary system, of course, had a set of rules. Looking back at these exchange rates from 1969, some of us may feel nostalgic. Also at the currencies, which no longer exist. The linchpin of this system was that the US dollar was supposed to be constant in terms of gold, at least for official holders of dollar reserves. And this is something that came out of the US Gold Reserve Act of 1934. This system was established at Bretton Woods. Here you can see Lord Keynes chatting with the Soviet representative. The Soviet Union was at Bretton Woods, supported the agreement, ultimately did not join. In fact, Russia, after the Soviet Union broke apart, joined in 1992. And interestingly, the famous long telegram from Moscow that George Kennan sent was triggered by the Soviets refusing to join the Bretton Woods institutions. The State Department, said to Kennan, the Treasury, "What's going on? Why aren't they joining?" And George Kennan's response was the long telegram, like, "Get real, guys. This is who we're dealing with." So the US had great power, but also great responsibility. The N-1 problem dictated this. With N currencies, there are N-1 exchange rates. So the US alone didn't have to peg to another currency. Supposedly, it was maintaining the gold link. And at some level, confidence in the system depended on whether the US could and would redeem official gold holdings. There were two threats to this commitment. One, the US dwindling gold supplies. By 1960, the US stock of gold could only just cover official liabilities to foreigners. We can have several hours on the Triffin problem. My view is that it was mostly a fiscal problem. Basically, that the U.S. Could have bought more gold and used it to pay off these liabilities, but to do so in the amounts that eventually became necessary would have pushed the price of gold up on the market and bankrupted the U.S. So a slightly different form of the Triffin dilemma. But more importantly, I think, and certainly more important in terms of the politics, was that the US trade balance was deteriorating secularly. And this became a major, perceived as a major problem by the end of the 1960s. Now I'm stealing from Bob Aliber here, who has written about this analogy, but it's too good to pass up, Bob, so I'm sorry. But some of the concern about gold was represented in the popular culture of the time. Notably the Goldfinger, the book and the movie. But what I want to highlight here is the prices of these items. In 1959, you could buy the book for 35 cents. The ticket price for the film in 1964 was still 85 cents. So what this is trying to highlight is that growing inflation was a problem, particularly in the United States. Now, why was there inflation? Big literature on this. Certainly, the guns as well as butter policy of LBJ was an issue, as was his browbeating of the Fed prior to the 1968 election. So this was the internal balance problem. There was also an external balance problem, the U.S. balance of payments. We discussed the U.S. capital control regime yesterday, and this was something that escalated over the 60s to try to keep too much gold from leaving. There was trade competition for U.S. industries, which became an issue. Whereas the U.S. labor movement had supported the Kennedy round of tariff cuts, this had all changed by the end of the decade. And we had the beginnings of outsourcing. Post-war reconstruction had succeeded all too well, and imports were coming in from Europe and Japan. In addition, there was an ongoing war, and U.S. allies increasingly resented the war, the U.S.'s perceived high-handedness. U.S. inflation was spilling over to them. They didn't like that either. And then across the world, particularly in the U.S., but not just the U.S., there were racial tensions, student protests, social strife. So these were the sort of tensions that existed when the Nixon administration came in January of 1969. But there was also a huge opportunity that Nixon and Henry Kissinger perceived, which was the growing split between China and the USSR. So all of this played out against Nixon's burning desire, natural desire perhaps, but still burning, to be reelected in 1972, and to, as we learned, basically stop at very little to make that happen. Several developments followed from this. The U.S. abrogated the gold commitment. Bretton Woods fixed exchange rates collapsed. Inflation emerged as a chronic global problem, which it had not been in the post-war period. Free market, laissez-faire economics gained currency throughout the U.S. and throughout the world. The U.S. began to bring China into the global community. Energy became a major geopolitical and global economic issue. The countries of Europe sought greater economic and political unity. So I'll briefly go through all of these. But if you look at this collection of events, you can see how much they define the situation we find ourselves in today. Key date was Sunday, August 15th, 1971, when President Nixon went on television to announce his solutions to the joint internal and external balance problem of the United States. And those solutions were to order a wage and price freeze, to cut taxes, because there was a sense the US economy was flagging. This was before the supply side approach, but still, very traditional Republican approach. And he severed the link between the dollar and gold. He closed the gold window. Also, basically imposed a import surcharge to pressure European partners to revalue their currencies, because one of the features of the N-1 problem is that you can't devalue your currency. Everyone else has to revalue their currencies. Now, the U.S. could have changed the price of gold. The world community could have changed the price of gold, but that did not happen. And part of the reason, there are many reasons for that, one that was put forth was, do you really want to help Russia and South Africa? Okay, so let's look at inflation. It had been rising through the 60s. It reached roughly 6% in 1970. This was a cause of some panic for Nixon because the election was coming up. And I don't want to ascribe only political motives to him. Certainly it was a very legitimate problem to worry about this, to see this sort of inflation rate. Again, you can see the whole history that we know very well with inflation getting out of control in the 70s, then coming down, and then you see at the end where we are now post-COVID. So Nixon's gambit was politically successful, as we discussed yesterday, but it only kicked the can down the road. The wage and price freeze gave some quick results. Again, if you look at 1972, you see a drop in inflation to below 4%, but it bounces back. And once controls were removed in 1973, inflation exploded to 11% in 1974. Now, this wasn't entirely bounced back from the wage and price controls, although that was a factor. In addition, the price of oil had surged. I'll say more on the oil price in a moment. And also there was the depreciation of the dollar in foreign exchange markets. Of course, it had to await Paul Volcker for inflation to be tamed. Many central banks later adopted inflation targeting, but as we sit here with high inflation across the world, we ask ourselves, is that enough? Will we return to low inflation, or will we be in a world with chronically higher inflation? Now, the excellent Garten book was also mentioned yesterday, 3 Days at Camp David. This solved the gold problem, but it solved it unilaterally. The import surcharge, the insistence that trade partners revalue was also resented by allies. One little remembered feature of the time, though some of you will remember it, was Nixon's Guam Doctrine, where he called on allies to bear more of their own defense costs. This was something that certainly came back big time in the Trump administration, but importantly, it was also an element in improving the US balance of payments. If the US could sell all these arms to our allies who were undertaking their own defense costs, that would be a win-win. So Nixon was in many ways very America first. Just to continue the story, of course, the currency realignments of 71 did not restore confidence in the dollar. More speculation ensued. European countries had to intervene to defend the new parities. As they intervened, they bought dollars, paid for them by creating their own currencies. Reserve levels and money supply levels in these partner countries ballooned. Inflation rose as a result. And this is actually the natural adjustment process under a reserve currency system when the reserve currency center is engaging in inflationary policies. This is what sort of gets you to back to equilibrium real exchange rates, inflation in the partner countries. By March 73, 50 years ago, countries had largely given up, allowed their currencies to float, and as you can see, the dollar plummeted thereafter, basically validating the idea that it had in fact been undervalued. Now, another legacy of this period is the impetus toward free market economics, which is also remains with us and which is in tension with other approaches. There were free market conservatives in the administration, George Shultz, Herb Stein, also outside advisors like Milton Friedman and Alan Greenspan, who favored market-determined exchange rates, and we're very happy to see the Bretton Woods arrangements in the rearview mirror. I mean, others like Paul Volcker were more desirous of retaining an international monetary system. Once floating exchange rates arrived, the free marketers also promoted financial liberalization. This is a complex story. It's related to the desire to raise the status of the US as a global financial center. A similar motivation underlay the British authorities' attitude throughout the 60s to the Eurodollar market. You know, if London can't be a top market, financial market based on sterling, maybe it can be a top financial market based on dollars. The inflation of the 70s supported this view toward Friedman-like nostrums on monetary policy and also on free market solutions more generally. And this was taken up by Thatcher, by Reagan, and has remained a major theme in policymaking. In terms of financial liberalization, again, this is a very complex and big story, but using the the Lane and Milesi-Ferretti data, you can see how global external assets and liabilities exploded. And this is only one metric of the incredible growth of international financial markets, which really took off in the 1990s. Energy geopolitics also came to the fore in this period. And it's related, I believe it's related to the macroeconomic disruption. Oil was priced in dollars. When Nixon devalued the dollar, the prices, real prices that oil exporters received fell. The Yom Kippur War and the embargo of oil exports by Arab members of OPEC pushed up world prices, but also showed the way forward for OPEC and showed the potential to control the world price of oil, which quadrupled between October 73 and January 74. OPEC has taken advantage of its market power ever since, and this has, of course, shaped the geopolitics of the world, the relationships between the Middle East, Europe, the US. Interestingly, while the idea of raising the gold price was opposed by some because it would have enriched the Soviet Union, higher oil prices enabled the USSR to become an oil exporter in 1973 for the first time. So, and that obviously, Russia's status as an oil exporter, as a natural gas exporter, is something that's central to today's global economy and today's geopolitics. Essentially, OPEC and Russia have joined in OPEC Plus, and they control the world oil price to some degree. Nixon rushed out his August 71 announcements because he did not want to overshadow this, and he wanted this to play well in the election, the opening to China. Again, only Nixon could go to China, and Nixon did go to China, and electorally, it was a huge success. And for China, it was a huge success as well. You all know the story. Under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, the freeing of markets led to a spectacular growth in real GDP for China over the subsequent decades. But by the 2000s, these increased Chinese exports, which were driving its growth, were having a disruptive effect on labor markets in the US and elsewhere, not unlike the effects of Japanese and European imports early on. A final effect of US policies, which we alluded to yesterday, and Harold mentioned this in his session, was to drive Europeans closer together. With growing monetary instability driven by the US, members of the EEC wanted to link their currencies more closely. They set up a snake mechanism of tighter mutual exchange rates. And in October 1970, the Werner Report, for the first time, set out a phased path to a single European currency. So this was immensely visionary and important. It was opposed by the US, but of course, after many, many events, including the fall of the Soviet bloc and the unification of East and West Germany, the idea became reality in 1999 and is one of the major building stones of the modern international monetary system, the single European currency. One last thing is Brexit. Maybe not as significant as other events, though clearly significant for the UK and significant as a political bellwether in the world. In 1972, Britain joined the European Economic Community, but it left the currency snake at the same time. The Werner Report actually caused a lot of concern in British economic policymaking. And as a result, the EEC was actually opposed by many British economists from the left and from the right. Both Harry Johnson and Nicholas Caldor thought joining the EEC was a terrible idea for Britain. In 1975, in a referendum, 2/3 of Britons supported remaining in, but I would maintain that the UK decision to leave the snake set in train events that would lead to a very different referendum outcome in 2016. And here you can see the young Margaret Thatcher campaigning for Britain to remain in the EEC in 1975. So how things have changed. Let me wrap up with some legacies for today. They're fairly obvious. The whole experience raises questions about the role of the US in world order. And of course, it was Nixon who very much raised these questions by the way he left the Bretton Woods system. America first, or should the US be a provider of global public goods, partially in its own self-interest, but also in the interest of the world? What will be the future of US and China relations? Cooperation, rivalry, decoupling, war? When Nixon went to China, Mao said to him on the subject of Taiwan, "We can wait maybe even 100 years." Well, we're only 50 years into that, and this could accelerate. Will the world now become bipolar, tripolar? I think Philippe was correct in what he conjectured yesterday, that the EU is not going to break away from the US. I think the Ukraine war has established that, at least for the medium term. What about Russia's challenge to the US, the EU, and the global order? That challenge was there 50 years ago in the Cold War, but it's become particularly menacing today, although it is maybe more regionalized than it was then. But in a sense, not really. The Wagner Group is in Africa, and Russia is trying to extend its influence there, also in the Middle East. So not that different. What about inflation? Big problem 50 years ago. We thought we had beat it, but it's back. The jury's out on how this will turn out. What about Keynesianism? If you go back 50 years ago, Nixon declared he was Keynesian at one point. Then everyone became a monetarist. With the global financial crisis and the COVID crisis, Keynesianism had reestablished itself. But will there be a backlash due to inflation? What will we be saying as a profession in 5 years' time? And I'd be remiss not to mention the biggest crisis of all that we face, which is climate, and whether the global community can pull together to solve that. As it turns out, the first Earth Day was on April 22nd, 1970, and it helped launch the environmental movement in the US and globally. And on the prospects for containing global warming, the jury is indeed still out. So I'll stop there. So we don't have time for questions in the program, so I'm certainly happy to talk more over coffee. but or via email. But we'll move on to panel number 5.
All right, good morning, everyone. We had a very enlightening and thought-provoking day yesterday, and we look forward to 2 excellent panels today to wrap things up. Richard Portis noted yesterday, mid-morning or so, that we had said very little about Europe, and Shangjin Wei also later in the morning said we had said very little about China. So when we focused on the events of 1973, focus has been a bit on Western Europe, United States, and Japan. But of course, we did introduce other regions of the world. And what we want to do in this panel today is consider the non-OECD, or at least the non-core OECD countries in terms of what happened with the move to flexible exchange rates. Now, for emerging markets and developing countries, it's not quite a 50th anniversary. So as we noted yesterday too, and we saw in the evolution of exchange arrangements, developing countries and emerging markets moved much later to floating, sort of transitioned to a more flexible exchange rate regime in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. And what we want to consider now is what has their experience been? How have they coped in this new environment, and what challenges have they faced? We have 3 excellent panelists this morning. Unfortunately, Carmen Reinhart couldn't join us, but we do have a great deal of expertise coming before you right now. Our first speaker will be Muhammad Chatib Basri, who's the former finance minister of Indonesia, also the former chair of the Indonesian Investment Coordinating Board. He's currently a senior lecturer at the University of Indonesia and chair of PT Bank Mandiri. He will speak first. Then we'll have Adnan Manzari, former deputy director of the IMF's Middle Eastern and Central Asia Department, where he worked on many financial crises, including that in Russia in 1998. He's been a non-resident senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute since 2019. And then finally, last but certainly not least, Andres Velasco, currently the dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics, but he's had a most distinguished career, professor at the Kennedy School of Government, member of the G20 Eminent Persons Group, and of course, he'll go down in history as the best finance minister Chile has ever had throughout his long tenure. So with that, we'll still enforce the 10-minute rule, just so we have plenty of time for discussion, and that's what the presenters have prepared for. So let's start right now.
Thank you very much. Very good morning to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank the PIIE and also Maurice and Doug for having me. It is a great pleasure and honor to be here to speak all the esteemed speakers, all those names that I know only from the economic journals or the textbook when I was a student at the Faculty of Economics. My talk this morning will be more on the perspective of the former policymaker. So I'll be speaking about the Indonesian experience when we adopt this 2 exchange rate regime, a 3 exchange rate regime, basically fixed exchange rate, managed floating, and also the flexible exchange rate. And the question is, why Indonesia? Indonesia is a very interesting country because we had so many financial shocks and also economic crisis. So I think this is a good laboratory to learn about both theory and also practice. We know that in theory, we know everything, but nothing works. In practice, everything works, but we don't know why. And in the case of the Asian financial crisis, Indonesia is a good combination of theory and practice. Nothing works, and we don't know why. So this is sort of like a combination of it, and I'll be speaking following this. So there are 3 questions to be addressed in my presentations. We understand that the global financial crisis, the taper tantrum, had a magnitude even bigger in terms of scale compared to the Asian financial crisis. But the first question is, why Indonesia able to weather the global financial crisis and the taper tantrum, but not the Asian financial crisis. The second one, if I'll explain about it later on, when we managed the taper tantrum 2013, the policy that government and central bank adopted were pretty much similar like what we did back on the Asian financial crisis. But the question is why Indonesia, similar together with India, were able to, out of the so-called the fragile five, they are so-called, there is a coined term by the Morgan Stanley about the fragile five, Indonesia, India, Turkey, South Africa, and Brazil at the time. Why those two countries were able to, to manage the taper tantrum. And then the question is, I'll be focusing, of course, there is no single explanation related to it. What was the role of the flexible exchange rate on that? So let me start by sort of like giving the chronology about the exchange rate regime in Indonesia. Thanks to my colleague Mary, she reminded me to put this chronology here. Indonesia adopted the fixed exchange rate until 1978, because the oil boom in Iran at the time, if I'm not mistaken. So we had a problem of Dutch disease. Yeah, so by 1978, Indonesia abandoned the fixed exchange rate for the reason to boost export. So what the government did at that time the central bank was still under, it should be coordinated with the Ministry of Finance. Yeah, so what Indonesia did at that time, we adopt the so-called the crawling peg or managed floating rate, which is every year we had a depreciation of 5%. This was from 1978 to 1997. But at the same time, the problem was inflation in Indonesia was much higher than inflation in the world. So the implication, the central bank should impose the interest rate higher than the world interest rate. So for many sectors, it was much easier and much cheaper if they borrow money from outside. So the issue of this original sin. And this led to an increase in the short-term external debt, and the short-term borrowings were used to fund long-term projects. So there are two issues here. Double mismatch both on the currency and maturity. So many companies, they did not hedge until the 1997. And what happened in 1997? Because the speculative attack in Thailand on July 27 at 1997, Thai baht was abandoned, and there was a strong pressure for the Indonesia for the depreciation of the exchange rate. So the Bank Indonesia adopted the flexible exchange rate, but because the huge short-term external debt and there was no hedging, so there was a balance sheet effect when we adopt the flexible exchange rate. So as a result, there was a banking crisis, etc. And 2005, Bank Indonesia adopted inflation targeting regime with a flexible exchange rate. And quite similar, consistent with the yesterday presentation, inflation declined from around, back on 2007 to 2015 was around 7 to 8%. Now it is about between 3 to 4%. So then, now the first question is, why did Indonesia survive the global financial crisis and taper tantrum, but not Asian financial crisis? Of course, I cannot answer this question by saying that because this is the role of exchange rate. There are a couple of explanations. The first one is we adopt a different policy response. Asian financial crisis, global financial crisis. If you look at, I don't want to go into detail in it, what we did during the global financial crisis was completely the opposite on what we did in the Asian financial crisis. We lowered the interest rate, we expand the fiscal policy, we bail out the banking sectors during the, because at that time, based on the recommendation of the fund, we tightened the monetary policy, we tightened the fiscal, and we closed 16 banks at that time. But the other very interesting explanation is the flexible exchange rate. Why is that? Because after 1997, people accustomed to the fluctuation of the exchange rate. So now, because we adopted the flexible exchange rate, the economic actors were accustomed to exchange rate risks. They started to do hedging, etc. This helped. So even though during the global financial crisis, rupiah depreciated quite significantly, similar to during the taper tantrum, but we managed those two crises in relatively in good manner. During the global financial crisis, when the global economy was plummeted minus 1.3%, the Indonesian economy grew by 4.8%, the second fastest growing economy of the member of the G20. And the other explanation is, of course, the banking sector. Because we implement the economic, this is recommended by the fund, to do the banking reform, sort of like benchmarking to the Basel best practice, etc. It helps a lot. The other thing is fiscal policy. We adopt the fiscal rules, which is the maximum budget deficit is 3%. And that's the reason why we were able to lower the debt to GDP from 120% to become, when I left MOF was around 23% at the time. Yeah, so some of the reform back on 1998 helped us. But the important explanation is also because the role of exchange rate would help us to mitigate, to absorb the shock. Now the question is, can we use the exchange rate as the only shock absorber, as we learn from the so-called, from the textbook about the so-called the trilemma? So I know this chart is rather busy, but let me explain this chart a little bit. During when there was a quantitative easing, this is the foreign reserve. You can see, because the quantitative easing, the foreign reserve increased substantially because there was a capital inflow to emerging market, including Indonesia. So we had a problem of the overvaluation of the exchange rate here. The rupiah appreciated strongly. As a result of this appreciation, the economy growth increased, the GDP growth increased, but at the same time, we started to become a victim of our own program because our current account started to become deficit because of it. So what were the policy options for our central bank? If they let the exchange rate to appreciate, it's going to kill the export. If we try to sterilize the exchange rate, then there is a big spread between Fed fund rate and also the Bank Indonesia rate. The cost of sterilization is very expensive. If we adopt the so-called the trilemma, so it means that we need to lower the interest rate. That's what we learned from the textbook. But the implication is, because the economic boom, we are in the position of this full employment and also the positive external balance. So under this kind of situation, if we lower the interest rate, and what will happen? This will boost the economy more into overheating. So there is a sort of like a conundrum related to the implication of the trilemma here. Until we had this, we ran a current account deficit here. And the central bank, what they did at the time, they tried to do the sterilization and also intervention at the forex market. That is why the forex market dropped. Until 2013, when Chairman Bernanke announced the tapering talks. The tapering talks. So we had to manage the taper tantrum. What we did at the time, I learned this from Maurice's book and Jeff Frankel's book. If you have a problem of current account deficit, what you need to do is expenditure switching and expenditure reducing policy. So we cut the budget, adjusted the fuel subsidy for 45%. I stopped reading the local newspaper and local TV for 1 month, because this politically too very difficult. And we let the exchange rate to depreciate. But the problem is we cannot entirely use the monetary the trilemma. Why is that? Because there is a differing monetary policy objective on this: growth, external balance, and also full employment. The second one, we had a trauma back on 98, because the volatile exchange rate. Every time there was an exchange rate overshooting, people start to get trauma because of that. And balance sheet effect. And if you're talking about what about fiscal, we should tighten the fiscal policy. Indonesia is a country we experience the commodity super cycle. And the implication is there is pro-cyclical policy. And tightening fiscal during the commodity boom is very difficult. I like to quote what Jean-Claude Juncker said. We all know what to do. We just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. So this is politically, it's not easy. But we managed the taper tantrum relatively well because and did not create the panic because policy credibility and communication. I think I would like to emphasize before I conclude my remarks, the importance of this policy credibility and communication. I recall during the, I know this is on the record, but I would like to share with you, during the limited breakfast meeting in IMF back on 2013, Governor Rajan and myself, we raised this issue about the importance of the communication between Fed and emerging economies because their policy will have an impact. And we had a discussion, but basically the response from Chairman Bernanke at the time, get your house in order. We did, but I think the communication, like after Janet Yellen took over and also Jerome Powell, become the chair of Fed, was much better. The implication of it, I think, we can use the flexible exchange rate. It helped us to manage the many financial shocks, but at the same time, we somehow also need a sort of like exploring possibility of the capital flow management. So I think I leave it up here. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My job is to explain why for the past 50 years we've been admiring fixed exchange rates in the Middle East oil exporters and not listening to anybody else. I'll first talk about this one group of the countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and then the others, the larger ones, and then address, is there a chance for more flexibility in the future and some systemic implications? First, this is what the system looks like. The top 6 are the GCC ones. You see only one has a basket, but that basket is mostly dollars. The rest call themselves, and the IMF calls them everything else, but they all have, at one point or another, until forced to, fix their exchange rates. And even when after they've been forced to leave, they haven't left. They've tried multiple exchange rates. There are parallel market rates, floating rates that determine much of economic activity as price signals, but they're not part of the official system. Now, why do the GCC peg? First, the most important thing to realize, in my opinion, about these economies is that they're rentier economies. Oil comes to the state, they distribute it. So fiscal dominance is written into the DNA of the economy, and they're not going to give that up anytime soon. They are undiversified. They use the exchange rate as nominal anchors, and flexibility has also been difficult for them because they fear losing a lot on, they're mostly dollar-denominated balance sheets, sovereign wealth funds, etc. And they feel their fiscal policy frameworks are strong enough, and that's the flexible tool. Also, they get some real exchange rate movement through flexible migrant labor-based, which allows them to basically fire people quickly. But also, much has been a function of geopolitics and petrodollar recycling. The roots of this infatuation, part of it, go back to the 1973 agreement between the US and Saudis, negotiated from the US side by Henry Kissinger and William Simon. And Henry Kissinger was the good cop. And in return, they got some defense protection, some of which the Saudis at least feel was blown by Mr. Trump, despite his rhetoric. The other oil exporters, they've always pegged until they get into a huge political situation or geopolitical situation or wars. They still try to maintain it. They move to multiple rates. But in addition, these are the countries, especially Iran and Algeria, that have had to try to promote import substitution and keeping an appreciated exchange rates. Also, these have over time become very vulnerable to political shocks, sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. So they don't want their exchange rates to be subject to the whims of politics. But also, a huge issue is that once the systems are put in place, governance and corruption take over and pick up a life of their own. For example, at one point in Iran, we used to have 12 exchange rates. That didn't come out of deep theory. It is a subsidy taxation system. And once you put those systems in, it's very hard to leave. What could happen in the future? First, on the role of the dollar. There's a lot of talk about shifting the denomination of oil prices. This may happen, but let's not exaggerate its potential, because oil exporters know by pricing in yuan, let's say, they confer upon a country that has a tendency to manipulate its exchange rate some market power over the price of oil. They will not do this too willingly. And even if they do that, they will very unlikely give up settlement of oil receipts in yuan. They want to be paid in dollars for very similar reasons, and also the fact that China does not produce much in terms of safe assets from their perspective. Now, there are, as many people have discussed yesterday and today, issues of geopolitics and fear of sanctions, de-risking. But the prospects for example, $4 trillion in sovereign wealth funds of the oil exporters of the Middle East, assets to be redistributed globally, are not very strong. Okay. Now, on exchange rate flexibility, would they move to more flexibility? It is likely that the GCC very slowly moves and puts in place some of the preconditions. We at the fund, I should say they at the fund now, I've always told the GCC that fixed exchange rates are pretty suitable for them. And probably this has been right, given all the considerations. Although they could have handled many crises, especially for example, the 2014 price drop in oil, much more elegantly had they been more flexible with the exchange rate. The big issue is climate change, risk of moving to stranded oil assets, and also totally mismanaging the fiscal on account of large projects. For example, the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia that is supposed to cost $500 billion. The other oil exporters do not have the institutional setup, and the institutions are fragmented. For example, since 2011, for much of that period, Libya has had 2 central banks. You think you guys have had some difficulty. Imagine having two central banks in your country. And given the prevalence of highly polarized politics domestically, conflicts geopolitically, and sanctions, they do not have the frameworks to move away anytime soon from the ad hoc systems that they have. Are we going to see major changes with systemic implications? Very little. There were some discussions about how these countries may move to diversify some of their invoicing under pressure. For example, Iraq has moved recently to some yuan denomination of its trade, but this will be slow. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Oh, there we go. Brilliant. Thank you so much for inviting me. Great to see some dear friends. I should say that Doug and I were in the same class in our PhD program, and Maurice taught us macro. So he is responsible for anything that might come. All the good things, of course. Bad things are my own. We had Maurice Obstfeld, Guillermo Calvo, and Ned Phelps teaching us Introduction to Macroeconomics, some 40 years ago or something like that. So I feel like I'm back in the 80s, Maury. Thank you very much. Thank you, Doug. So Carmen is not here. And there's a whole region of the world that presumably I'm expected to talk about. And I will talk a little bit about Latin America, but I want to talk about emerging markets and flexible rates more generally. And in fact, what I will say, I think fits very nicely and naturally after the two very rich and wonderful presentations we have just had. So if I can get this thing to move. That's my shopping list for the next 10 minutes. I want to ask whether flexible exchange rates really deliver monetary independence for emerging markets. I want to talk a little bit about how much insulation they really give. Talk a little bit about the old subject of original sin and balance sheet concerns. We just heard in both presentations the phrase balance sheet issues, and I want to say a bit about that. I want to ask, why is it that everybody floats but nobody floats cleanly, which is an interesting fact of life. And of course, I will echo some of Pierre-Olivier's concerns last night about the absence or the partial nature, did I say that politely enough, the partial nature of the global safety net. I keep going in the wrong direction. There we go. So, we were all raised in the tradition of Mundell and Fleming. We all know there's something called the impossible trinity. We all know that if you're willing to give up exchange rate stability, then presumably you get monetary independence. You can target the interest rate at domestic conditions, and then presumably happiness prevails. Well, that's the way it's supposed to be, but thanks to many people in this room, we have learned in an academic way what we sort of knew from the world out there already. And I'm thinking, of course, of Hélène's great work and Hume's, et cetera, et cetera. You know, you don't have to be a holder of a French passport to really worry about the dominant role of the dollar. And you don't have to be a holder of a French passport to understand that whenever the dollar moves, other things happen in the rest of the world that are very difficult to counteract. Not impossible, and I will add a bunch of caveats in my next slide, but the starting point, yes, international conditions matter a lot. The flexible exchange rate helps, but doesn't do away with this dominance of the dollar. And in some sense, to cite another one of my teachers, mentors, and economists that I admire hugely, Guillermo Calvo with Leo Lederman and Carmen Reinhardt a long time ago pointed out that if you are an emerging market, the action is outside. That is to say, what really drives whether capital is coming into the country or is leaving the country is not so much your actions. It is very, very much determined by international conditions. Which is kind of, if you're running an emerging market, and several people in this room have been central bank presidents or finance ministers of emerging markets, we would love to think that whatever happens, happens because of our wonderful actions, right? And that if we behave properly, then capital will flow in. Well, it's not like that. Oftentimes you behave quite nicely, but capital flows out. Jose Gregorio, who's here, and Jose was the president of Central Bank of Chile. I was the finance minister of Chile at the time of the great financial crisis. And I remember meeting in the Burger King of National Airport after a very long flight from Santiago to Washington for the IMF World Bank meetings and saying, oh my God, we have a fiscal surplus, we have well-regulated banks, everything is in place. And nonetheless, capital is flowing out and out and out, So even if you're a good country, bad things can happen. That's more or less the summary. And as we know, and there are lots of papers out there, once you know what's happening to the dollar in emerging markets, you know what's happening to capital flows, credit conditions, domestic output, consumption, investment. Yes, some emerging markets in some episodes have been known to loosen when the US tightens, but these episodes are pretty much few and far between. Also, you do it at your peril, and therefore a lot of countries choose simply not to do it. So my first slide is fairly pessimistic. It says, well, yes, that Mundelian promise is not quite up what Bob Mundell told us it might be. On the other hand, flexible exchange rates are better than any alternative. And again, there's a pretty large literature on this, but I'm going to quote Maurice, a paper that came out in the NBR working papers quite literally last week or 2 weeks ago. Yes, whatever happens to the dollar predicts outcomes in emerging markets, but not all the emerging markets are alike. The degree to which changes in international conditions hit the emerging market depends on a bunch of things, and the most important one of those things is, in fact, the exchange rate regime. That is to say, if you are hit by a 10% dollar appreciation, and in this context, dollar appreciation is not vis-a-vis your own currency, it's dollar vis-a-vis the other major currency, so this is a period of strong dollar, and if you're Chile or Indonesia or Brazil, GDP, and I'm going to quote Maurice here, GDP, investment, and the stock market fall more sharply for pegs. This is one example of a broad literature which suggests that this is exactly the same. So why is it? Here, I think the standard textbook model does reasonably well. Of course, because to sustain the peg, you have to tighten, and when you tighten, bad things happen. In addition, Shebnev here at this table has provided sort of a twist on that story, which I think is a good one, which is when the dollar becomes strong, risk appetite drops, people demand a larger return, an excess return, if they're going to buy Indonesian bonds or Chilean bonds or Brazilian bonds. So what happens then? How do you accomplish that excess return? There are two ways of doing so. One is you jack up the nominal interest rate at home to the ceiling and you sink the economy, or the other one is you let the currency depreciate, therefore it has room to appreciate, and therefore that provides a bit of a sort of excess return. And last but not least, because the old, forget the financial side, just think of the real side, expenditure switching does matter. If you look, it's not cited here, but if you look at growth episodes in emerging markets, they typically begin with a period of sustained depreciation. So if you depreciate, you export. If you export, you grow to a first approximation. So my second slide, the message is, it's not a great system, but it does some of the work. Notice saying that you contract less than countries with pegs is not the same as saying that you are immune. It is not the same as saying that you ride through the episode unscathed, unharmed. It simply says you suffer less. So it insulates, but it does not provide complete happiness. And, I'm citing sort of the academic literature here, but this, it survives what I would call the gut feeling test. If you've been a policymaker in an emerging market and it has been 3 a.m. and you've thought to yourself, oh my God, what a terrible system. And then you think, is there any other system that I would rather adopt? And you think, well, probably not, right? I'm stretching here my story, of course, because Chile has an independent central bank. So the gentleman over there was in charge of the exchange rate. Whatever I had said, had very little weight, but whatever. I did have this, thought process at 3 a.m. and I concluded, yeah, even if the world is tanking, could I come up with a better system? Probably not. Now, balance sheets. In both presentations that preceded me, we heard the phrase, and of course, you know the story. Most emerging markets borrow heavily abroad for good reasons, consumption smoothing, they're growing, they will be richer tomorrow than they are today, so they want to bring some of that wealth to the present, standard economics, and of course, to this day, 80% of outstanding emerging market debt remains in dollars. And therefore, many of us, especially after the Asian crisis, I think, and to some extent after the tequila crisis of '94, developed this gut-level intuition that, well, floating may be nice for rich countries, but if you speak Spanish, it's not going to work because all those dollar debts will get you into trouble. Whenever the exchange rate depreciates sharply, your firms that have income in domestic currency will suffer. This will have a second-round effect of financial crisis and default. Therefore, depreciation can be contractionary. Flexible exchange rates are not a good idea. That's where I kind of entered, again, my gut feeling going into this world, say, back in, 1995. I will confess that not a lot of that has happened. My gut feeling seemed to be pretty misguided. I think, it is fair to say that balance sheet effects are out there. We worry about them. In practice, they have not been as large, as dangerous, and as destructive as one might have feared. Why is this? I'm happy that this is the case, by the way, because I wrote a couple of academic papers with models that argue that this should be the case. So as a policymaker, I feel cheated. As an academic, I feel vindicated. I stand somewhere in between here. And there are 2 or 3 reasons. One is your reason, that that is real insulation. Secondly, because it's a matter of relative magnitudes. Even if the balance sheet effect is there, that makes the depreciation contractionary, but standard switching makes it expansionary. Which is bigger? It's an empirical matter. We don't really know. And last but not least, because balance sheets, of course, are not exogenous, they're endogenous. If I am a firm and I'm borrowing, and I think the central bank will be floating, well, I'm going to structure my liabilities in a different way. Roberto Chang, my beloved co-author, and I have a paper in the JIE in 2006 in which we show that the world has 2 equilibria. If people expect the central bank will float, they acquire a structure of liability such that ex post the central bank finds it optimal to float. And conversely, if people expect the central bank will fix, they borrow in dollars a lot, they don't hedge, and ex post the central bank finds it optimal to fix. So this suggests that we need to not only have flexible, it suggests that we need to have credible flexing, and that in turn will make the structure of liabilities a little bit less exposed. Again, I don't want to go all the way. I do not want to claim the problem has disappeared. But my impression, both from the academic literature and from looking at the world, is that the balance sheet problem is manageable. Balance sheets are endogenous, and therefore we are not stuck in a terrible situation inevitably. Last but not least, a word on original sin. The 80% number is an average, and it may be a little bit misleading. There are countries where liabilities have really moved toward domestic currency heavily. Colombia is the case, Brazil is the case, Mexico is the case, South Africa, of course, my own Chile. But again, this is not a panacea. Hune and Agustin Carstens have pointed out that yes, you shift the who bears the risk away from the domestic country and toward the international investor. But of course, the international investor now has to bear duration risk and currency risk. And that means that the international investor may say, nice little country, but not for me. Yeah. And therefore, you might have something called original sin redux in the terminology of Hune and Agustin Carstens. So bottom line, they're there, but they will not necessarily eat you alive if you float. Point. The conventional wisdom is that if you're a well-behaved country, you pursue inflation targeting, the interest rate is targeted at internal balance, and the exchange rate floats freely. And this is what we all say we do. Nobody does this, right? In Latin America, in South Asia, in East Asia, in South Africa, in Eastern Europe, countries that pursue inflation targeting, in fact, intervene. They don't intervene all the time, so it is not a dirty float in the traditional sense. They intervene, and every central bank uses pretty much the same phrase, whenever the currency is perceived to be strongly misaligned. And here I have 2 reactions to this observation. As a policymaker, I think it makes sense, but as an academic, I'm not sure why it makes sense. And I want to suggest that we don't really have a lot of very good models of why it is that we want to pursue something like a target zone. That's what central banks do, with the proviso, of course, that nobody knows the boundaries of the target zone, except for the central bank president and the central bank board. And those are not written in stone, they are implicit, they are moving, they are ever shifting, et cetera, et cetera. But central bankers have a sense, which, again, at the gut feeling as a policymaker I share, that exchange rates are not really anchored, and when shocks come or when expectations shift, they can really go in any direction, and we need to anchor them. As an academic, the only way I can think about this is, go back to Maurice and Ken's paper in 83. In a closed economy, it's very hard to rule out hyperinflationary paths. You really have to make a lot of strong assumptions to get rid of them. And the way you rule them out is by knowing that at some point, the fiscal authority will step in and will buy the money supply, right? In the open economy, I haven't written the paper, but I suspect it can be written. There's probably a similar effect. Namely, there are circumstances in which the exchange just goes off anywhere, and the only way to make it come back is to have a tacit commitment on the part of the central bank that at some point they will step in and buy the Turkish lira or the pesos at some price. And this is what brings the exchange rate back into that implicit band. Again, it's not a clear story. I think the academic literature here could do more, but practice, at least as a first approximation, seems to make sense. Last but not least, and I really have very little to say in addition to what Pierre-Olivier said, and said it very well last night, even if you float, and especially if you float in the manner that I have just described, you will need, you being an emerging market, we will need Latin America, Southern Africa, developing Asia, et cetera, at least, lots of dollars in at least 3 sets of circumstances. The first one is that during risk-off episodes of a dollar cycle, dollar is king, liquidity is king, and like rich countries do, you may need to inject dollar liquidity into your domestic financial system. Secondly, because as I argued a minute ago, you may need to intervene occasionally in the exchange market, and this requires reserves. Last but not least, because banks go belly up, as we learned yet one more time last week. And if a bank goes belly up in a peso country and you just give the bank a lot of pesos, well, we know what that happens. People take those pesos and try to buy dollars. So this will have an impact on the exchange rate. And therefore, you may have to be prepared to give dollars to the banks as emergency lending, and you must find the dollars somewhere. So again, standard economics, you can self-insure, sit on piles on reserves. Self-insurance is not efficient, it is not effective, it makes very little sense. We need to do risk sharing, and we do risk sharing as a planet pretty poorly today because emerging markets have access to dollars if and only if you qualify for a swap arrangement with a fund, and very few emerging markets do, or if you're a handful of countries that in fact have qualified for the IMF liquidity arrangements. Don't ask me what the acronym is because they change every year, but you know what I'm talking about. Those things that Chile, among other countries, used during COVID. But again, few countries use them. Few countries have access to swap lines with the Fed. Much of the world out there is left with very little. The global financial safety net is geographically fragmented, full of holes, and I think we can do better. Yes, we can. So finally, this is my last slide, I promise. I'm living in the UK, have been for 5 years, so I have to end on a British note. Let me paraphrase Winston Churchill. For emerging markets, a system of flexible exchange rates with occasional interventions is the worst policy except for all the others that have been tried. Thank you very much.
So while you're thinking of your questions, I just have 2 questions for the panelists. One is the contrast between Indonesia and the Middle Eastern oil exporters. I thought that was a sort of interesting contrast because Indonesia is also an oil exporter. We saw that you mentioned that the IMF thinks that, and it seems reasonable that for the Middle East, pegs are reasonable policy, but you spoke about the insulating properties of flexible exchange rates. So what's the contrast between those 2 regions? Is it just Indonesia's more diversified? And how does it differentiate itself from the Middle East? And is there lessons for the Middle East from the insulation properties that we see in Indonesia? So that would be my first question for you 2. And then for Andreas, you had it on your slide, but you didn't mention it. I thought it was a brilliant statement that could move forward in the academic literature and in policy discussions, the Catholic approach to exchange rates. The Catholic approach to exchange rates. So I'll ask you to elaborate just a moment on that because it's incredibly good. But I also wanted to ask you about Chile specifically. I distinctly remember your Princeton essay with Felipe Lorraine making the case for flexible exchange rate some 20 years ago or so, another beautiful essay. But it seems like Chile's sort of done well with capital controls and managing things, not just going to a pure float the way you as an academic and others had suggested. So I just wanted you to elaborate a bit on that. But first of all, yeah.
Thank you very much, Dow. Well, we are no longer a net exporter of oil. So until early 80s, we were a net exporter of oil, but not anymore nowadays. So the impact, I think, is quite different with the Middle East country. But I would like to say there is a similarities with some Middle East countries, but not come from oil, through the commodity boom, like coal, palm oil. So that is why in terms of this managing the exchange rate is also rather, floating exchange rate is also rather difficult for us because, as I mentioned in my remarks, our fiscal policy tend to be procyclical during the commodity boom. So when there was when there was a quantitative easing back on 2010 to 2012, it was a combination of the commodity supercycle, commodity boom at that time. So theoretically, we're supposed to tighten the fiscal, but that's not possible because the effect of the terms of trade effect, cannot entirely be compensated through the fiscal policy. So fiscal policy doesn't work. The only options available, the only policy options available are only the central banks. Using the interest rate, we let the exchange rate to follow the market. But because the jittery of this Asian financial crisis, we need to, similar like Andrea mentioned, somehow intervention in the forex market. Yeah, and also we introduced this macro prudential. Yeah, for example, I mentioned about this because we are an open capital account regime. We cannot impose the capital control, but what we did at that time, I call it is the reverse of the Tobin tax. So if they don't repatriate their profit, we give them the tax break. So that kind of things, we use to ensure that the capital stays in the country.
My understanding is that Indonesia has a much more diversified economy. So the exchange rate is a much more meaningful relative price. Secondly, the GCC countries have had large balance sheets in the form of sovereign wealth funds and central bank reserves that allows their fiscals to absorb a lot of punishment, which is not the case and has not been the case in Indonesia. And also the financial sector in Indonesia has been much more developed than in most of the Middle Eastern countries.
Thank you. I'm embarrassed that I forgot my punchline. Thank you for reminding me. Not on. There we go. Thank you. No, I was thanking Doug for reminding me that I thought I had a good line, but forgot to say my good line, so I'll say it now. If you come from a Catholic country, you can make fun of Catholic culture, so that's what I'm about to do. I sometimes feel that central banks do what the Catholic Church advises us to do. Namely, we say one thing, and then quietly we do something else. Central bankers say that they're going to pursue a very clean float, but de facto, pretty much every country, every emerging market country, of course the US, the UK are different beasts, every emerging market country under some set of circumstances intervenes. And they don't like to talk about it much, and when you ask about it, there's a sense of, we shouldn't be doing this, but in fact, everybody does. And I think everybody does for very good reasons. I don't think we have a very good model, as I mentioned in my remarks, but I think there are good reasons in search of a very good model. On Chile, I'll say a couple of things. My friend Jose here and I have a different view on this, so he may come back and disagree. I think the capital controls played an important role, but they haven't been around for at least 25 years. Chile had them in the early 90s during the transition, and I think they played an important role. Mind you, they were price and not quantity controls. They were a tax Chile, since 1990, has never had quantity controls, Argentine style, and I think that's a big difference. I think they played a role early on. Nobody has really seen a need for them in the last quarter century, but that could change. The other thing, of course, that has been behind, I think, Chile's relative success with monetary policy is the fiscal anchor. What's really striking about Chile is that it has had a succession of governments of the right, governments of the left. Today we have a government of the pretty far left, and Chile always has a sound fiscal policy. During COVID, like everybody else, we did crazy things, but Chile today has the most left-wing government Chile has had in its history since, we kicked out the Spaniards in 1810, and Chile has a fiscal surplus, okay? Not a primary fiscal surplus, an overall fiscal surplus. Along with Peru, by far the lowest debt as a share of GDP in Latin America. Not as low as it used to be. It's 38, maybe 40% today. It used to be 3% when we were in office. But in the current world, 30-some% is pretty good. So if you ask me, the fiscal anchor has been absolutely key, and that has really helped monetary policy do what monetary policy needs to do.
Great. We have 3 people patiently waiting there, and then we'll hit some people sitting down. So, Joe?
Thanks, Doug. I'm Joe Gagnon Peterson. I have a point that is woven into all 3 presentations, although it wasn't really made much of. But if you add them together in another observation, it seems to me to add up to something big, which is, Adnan, the countries you looked at least some of them, Saudi Arabia I know, I think maybe a few others, used to run current account deficits in the 80s and 90s and switched to big surpluses since about 2000, early 2000s. And the reason was they decided to start saving a lot of their revenues in foreign assets. And that's a big change in the world, and maybe in many ways it's a good thing, although I think a couple may have gone too far. Then Mohammed talked about Indonesia, which used to run current account deficits. Before the global financial crisis was running surpluses, even though it's a young, relatively fast-growing developing economy, it was actually not borrowing. When it moved into deficit, when the whole advanced economies went into a big recession, and Indonesia wasn't hit, the natural thing is to run a deficit, but you resisted it, and you started to buy a lot more foreign assets to resist that appreciation and go back to surpluses. As Andres said, this is not just unique to Indonesia. It's widespread across emerging markets, as you noted, Andres. They have piled up massive amounts of foreign exchange reserves and sovereign wealth assets. By the way, sovereign wealth assets are usually not counted as official assets. In the data, they're usually counted as private portfolio assets, but of course they're not. So when you look at official assets jointly, they are the only net thing that's changed over decades. Private flows actually aren't in big imbalances generally for most countries. So this is, and then you add in a few countries outside your remit that have massive surpluses and have done everything they can to hold on to them. Switzerland has bought 100% of its current account surplus. The Swiss National Bank has bought 100% of its current account surplus over the past decade in reserves. So what is the implication? Well, there's one country that has taken all the net deficits that go with this. And John Maria Moise-Freire has a paper he presented last fall in the IMF, which has the right title, I think. Many creditors, one large debtor. Is this a good outcome? And we used to worry about this when it was much, much smaller than it is now. And no one's talking about it yesterday or today. Are we, is it about to become important at some point in the next 5 or 10 years?
So let's collect 3 questions from the people standing. We'll get some answers, and then we'll turn to others in the audience. So Jeff.
Thank you. I want to rephrase Doug Irwin's question. The conventional textbook wisdom is that a small open economy should have a fixed exchange rate. But another conventional textbook wisdom is that if you have volatile terms of trade, you should have a floating rate or a flexible rate to accommodate them. These 2 conventional wisdoms all come in conflict for a lot of commodity producers. It's the small countries, the Gulf countries, and Ecuador and Brunei, they have firm pegs, but Norway and Russia are oil producers that have floating exchange rates, and it seems to have served them pretty well to accommodate terms of trade shocks. And then if we go beyond oil to other commodities, we have Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, some others that have floating exchange rates that are commodity producers, Chile. It seems to me that the flexibility has suited them as well. So that's a question for all the panelists. For Adnan in particular, do you have a view on the proposal to try to get the best of both worlds for commodity exporters, both the stability of a fixed exchange rate and the accommodation of terms of trade shocks of a flexible rate by pegging to a basket that includes oil or whatever your leading export commodity is?
And Steve.
Hi, Steve Kamen, American Enterprise Institute. I had a quick question about the here and now, which is over the last year, the Fed's raised interest rates very substantially. Over the past year, the Fed has raised interest rates very substantially. The dollar has soared. Historically, this would have very large impacts on emerging market economies of all exchange rate regimes. Yet, in this episode, most major EMEs have actually, managed the crisis relatively well. And you don't even see that many defaults on the part of the most vulnerable low-income countries. So I'd like to hear the panelists' views as to, do they agree with that characterization? And if so, what's changed from previous episodes of Fed tightening?
Great, let's just go down the line. Yeah.
Let me take the last question first. I think there are a couple of reasons. I'm speaking from the emerging market experience, like the so-called the fragile five before compare 2013 and now. One thing is one of the reasons why we had the taper tantrum at that time was a concern of the large current account deficit. The current account deficit in most of this country, the so-called the fragile five, were above 3%. But interestingly, in the so-called the taper tantrum for 2.0, if you look at the current account deficit on all of this country, much lower, even they run the current account surplus. And the reason behind it is because during the pandemic, the saving increased. That's the first reason. In the case of Indonesia, we are also lucky because this, geopolitical tension, etc. We had this positive terms of trade. Yeah. And so looking at this, the impact for the many emerging economies was relatively less compared to what we had 2013. Last but not least, in the case of Indonesia, 2013, the share of the foreign ownership to the government bond was around 40%. So if there is a shock in one country, then exchange rate plummeted. Now it's only about less than 15%. Let me go to Jeff's question now regarding this small open economy and also the terms of trade. A flexible exchange rate helped Indonesia a lot, Jeff, especially after the Asian financial crisis. That's the reason why we were able to manage the global financial crisis and also the taper tantrum in relatively well. But my only concern is we cannot use only the exchange rate as the shock absorber because maybe the trauma back on 1998. Every time the rupiah depreciate quite significantly, then market will start to question whether we will return to Asian financial crisis. But during the taper tantrum, rupiah was deliberately, the central bank did not intervene so much. We deliberately let the exchange rate to depreciate by 15 to 20%. As long as you provide the forward guidance and good communication, I think this helped us a lot. Yeah, especially when managing the terms of trade issue. We had a mild Dutch disease from 2002 until 2012 when the commodity boom increased. So somehow I would say that this flexible exchange rate helped us to manage this financial shock.
First, to Joe Gagnon's very good question. It doesn't, at the first blush, look right that a group of countries are becoming more indebted and a group of countries are building assets. But when you step back, those countries that are building assets are transforming wealth underground to wealth above ground. So that is the right event, transformation as far as those people are concerned. I would also add that arguably, because of climate change, the buildup of assets in those countries should be way larger. So they are under-saving. On the issue of the price of oil in the exchange rates of oil exporters, 4 reasons. First, I like that idea half the time. When price of oil goes down, through depreciation, there could be import compression, and it helps. So we're on the same page on that side. But when oil prices go high, I have no reason to change my currency as far as I'm concerned. The more suitable approach for me as an oil producer is to save it and not let it enter any other discussion. Of course, we often fail, but that's at least for me the first best policy. The second reason is the price of oil is not completely out of the control of the exporters. So in a way, by including the price of oil in your basket, you're actually pegging to something you have some control over, sometimes. Third, a weak reason, I admit, is that at times in high frequency, the price of oil is affected by the behavior of speculators. So I don't want those episodes to be automatically translating into an exchange rate change for me. So I would want to have much more discretion over time. Similarly, and even a weaker reason, is there are episodes where strange things happen. For example, because of the Ukraine war, after many, many years, the price of oil and the strength of the dollar are going in the same direction. So effectively, by being pegged to the dollar, I'm also pegged to the price of oil. However, admittedly, this is an aberration, and it will probably correct itself very quickly. But in that interim, I don't want that to be automatic. Thank you.
Thanks for the very good questions. On the single debtor, many savers question, completely agree with Adnan. It makes sense for countries that export oil to be building assets. On that side of the equation, I think we're all going to be in agreement. Just as Chile as an copper producer, accumulated a bunch of assets. But that takes us straight back to the question that we discussed yesterday: who provides those safe assets? And we all know that the scarcity of safe assets is a problem. I have nothing intelligent to say in addition to what was said yesterday, except to add a political reflection. Traditionally, the US was a producer of safe assets because the US was a politically sound country. And as a Latin American, I take great pride every day in what I would call the expansion of Latin American soft power. Namely, first American politics became Latin America, and now British politics under Liz Truss has become Latin American. So, our influence on the world is growing by leaps and bounds. But of course, we are not very good producers of safe assets. And when producers of safe assets go Latin American in their politics, one should worry. So yes, the question was, should we worry? My answer is yes, we should. Jeff's question, commodity producers. I have 2 quick answers, one normative and one positive. The normative one is, I suppose it is optimal if you only produce oil. But as Adnan pointed out earlier in his first reply 5 minutes ago, Indonesia, Mohammed said it, is diversified, the UAE is not. So is it obvious that you want to peg if you have a fairly diversified economy? Canada, Australia? Probably not. And the positive answer is, even if it happened to be optimal, can you do it? And my gut feeling would be, with the size and volatility of capital flows, until you're sitting, I mean, unless you're sitting on piles and piles of dollars, it's pretty unlikely that you can do it. So even if you had to, you probably can't. Today, I completely share the premise of the question. You know, the world has seen a very sharp spike in interest rates, beginning from a low base, granted, but you know, the speed and size of the increases has been remarkable. And everybody in this room knows that every time in the last 50 years you had a spike in US interest rates, you had a major meltdown in the emerging markets somewhere. So far you've had them, but in countries that are not systemic. Ghana, Sri Lanka, Zambia, Lebanon. Could you have it in a more systemic country? Your guess is as good as mine. So far it looks pretty good, but there are a number of countries, you know, some begin with T and they're on their eastern edge of Europe. Some begin with a B and they're very good at football. You know, could it happen there? I don't know. My only thought, and I will end here, is, you know, was it Rudy? I think it was Rudy Dornbush who used to say, crises always take much longer to arrive than you think, but when they arrive much faster than you think. Could that happen in, say, the second half of 23? Why not?
So we had question Sebnum, then Bob, then Lou. Once again, we'll collect 3 questions and then have another round.
Excellent panel. I just want to go back to this issue of, you know, why they are doing better this time. Andres just talked about, of course, this can get worse, back to Steve's question, but also what Mohammed said in terms of, you know, flexible helps, but that's not enough. And of course, that's combined with the big problem being the balance sheet effect, right? I mean, it's always about the balance sheet. It's always about the dollar debt. Otherwise, people don't care. So you know, and emerging markets did a lot on that. Banks now, to my knowledge, in most emerging markets are regulated to hedge, right? I mean, the hedging regulation changes. Some banks has to have closed positions by the end of the day, some within a week, like, you know, Turkish regulation, for example. And of course, then it switches to corporate sector, right? And the corporate sector have the same currency mismatch on balance sheet, which is, of course, why the authorities worry about it. So I would like to get your views on, you know, how can we improve on that? I mean, should we be thinking about some sort of macroprudential policy on the corporate sector, also forcing them to hedge? Or Mohammed mentioned when you have the flexible rate and, you know, that happens endogenously, you know, so the you know, firms that tend to hedge more, I mean, I assume these are, of course, the large firms, because hedging is costly, so it's not going to be everybody's, you know, game. So, you know, Brazil tried to have these markets onshore with NDF's intervention in the non-deliverable forwards during the taper tantrum. So, I mean, what do you think on these type of policies? Again, I mean, in the case of a global shock, of course, we need the safe asset, we need the dollar liquidity, that is still there. But from the emerging markets perspective, you know, can we do better on, you know, hedging that balance sheet risk, not just on the banks, but also on the corporate?
Let's go to Bob, and then we'll do Lou and Larry, and then we'll have another round of answers.
Thank you. A very exciting panel. I live in a very large emerging market country, the United States. Yes. I got to Chicago in 1965, a long time ago. Mm-hmm. Bob Mandel arrived the same year. On Monday, we'd go into Harry's workshop, and on Tuesday, we'd go into Milton's workshop. And Milton would be talking about monetary independence, but of course, in his world, there were no capital flows. And Bob would be talking about monetary independence with the Mundell-Fleming model, but it was you're either at one extreme or the other. That's not the way the world works. So what I loved about this morning's panel is that I heard the story of Iceland all over again. Indonesia is really, forgive me, Iceland. A country receives, let me backtrack to just, I got to Mexico in November 1994. I'd been in Toronto the week before and had stayed in the Four Seasons Hotel. Stayed in the Four Seasons Hotel in Mexico. Same hotel, room rate twice as high, right, in Mexico City. Couldn't explain it. Well, Mexico had experienced a massive capital inflow, which had led to a surge in asset prices. And then a month later, of course, we had the crash. So when I saw this lovely chart of Indonesia and that green line, there were two other variables that I couldn't see but could imagine. And one was what was happening to asset prices. And Indonesian asset prices must have been surging as a result of the capital flows. And this occurs because a country cannot achieve an increase in its capital account surplus unless there's a corresponding increase in its current account deficit. C plus K equals 0. If there's a shock to K, the domestic economy adjusts so that C is the mirror image of K. Thank you very much. Oh, lovely presentation. Very exciting.
We're getting a bit short on time, so two quick questions and then some quick answers.
So I'm reminded of the hyperinflations in Argentina and Brazil in the 90s and how pegged exchange rate regimes played a role in resolving those. I'm curious whether or not the panelists think that has any role in the current circumstance. And I was thinking specifically of Turkey. Obviously, part of the theme for emerging markets is this conference is how much progress has been made in the general credibility of policy. Historically, over this 50-year period, exchange rate pegs had played a role in that. And I'm just curious if any of you think it could play a role again. I would note that Turkey is facing an election. It is possible that we are going to move back to a more conventional policy approach there. It seems to me to be a relevant question. Thanks.
My question is for Andres. You remarked how many emerging market countries intervene quite regularly in the exchange rate market. Does it actually work? Is there any evidence? The Bank of Canada used to do that on a regular basis. Then we did a rigorous analysis of whether it actually had an impact, and we found it had no impact whatsoever. And I think, our experience is that when you have stable, fiscal monetary policy, the exchange rate tends to move for fundamental reasons, as Jeff pointed out. In cases like ours, where we're a commodity producer, commodity prices explain the exchange rate quite well. And so, if you have the exchange rate driven by fundamentals, generally speaking, why do you need to intervene?
So 2 minutes for each panelist, and then we'll wrap up and go for coffee.
Thank you very much. I try to respond, Satnam. I completely agree. So in practice, what the Bank Indonesia is doing now, we adopt the flexible exchange rate, not only with the so-called inflation targeting, but we call it flexible inflation targeting. So there is an element of the macro-prudential there. Yeah, for example, like if you borrow for the short-term borrowings, certain amount need to be locked up at the central bank for 1 year, just to that kind of things. So the macro-prudentials play a role. So my answer to this is, yes, it is true the banking sector is much easier. We can adopt the flexible exchange rate help. But somehow, I think we need the smart capital flow management in order to manage this. To Bob, I completely agree. That's exactly what happened in the case of Indonesia. Because the current account, the capital account surplus, then we run the current account deficit. So again, it shows this limitation in the case of this implementation, the impossible trinity. I have a paper entitled the impossible trinity. So probably there is a role for the capital flow management here. Thank you.
On Shebnem's question, balance sheet protection, of course, is going to be important. However, the balance sheets of the oil exporters, the ones in the Middle East, have sovereign wealth funds alone of over $4 trillion and reserves of about $1 trillion. They can do some hedging, and they do some hedging of the FX risk vis-a-vis the dollar. But to the extent they move or want to move to other things, hedging, FX risk hedging will be more difficult. Secondly, there is an issue of credit risk and, for lack of a better term, management risk of the other parts, the real assets, which are going to be very hard. For example, if you have real estate in New York and the price moves up and down, it's harder to hedge. And what I call the management risk is when it's governance-related ones, where under peculiar circumstances, a chunk of your assets, sovereign wealth fund assets, just disappear. For example, Kuwait, after the invasion of Iraq, it had a lot of real estate assets in Spain. Nobody knows where they are still.
Again, great questions. I'll try to be telegraphic because coffee is waiting. You're absolutely right that most emerging markets have regulated the banks so that they're not as risky as they ought to be. So the question is mostly about the non-bank sector. Can they hedge? My sense, and this is probably a small sample, is a few countries, sort of countries in the Pacific Rim of Latin America, the corporates are actually doing a fair bit of hedging. Some of the hedging is natural because the really indebted companies tend to be producers of exportable goods. So the hedge comes quite naturally. There is a hedging market. It's not very deep, but it's there. I suppose the question that I would pose, and I don't know what the answer is, who's on the other side of that hedge, right? Who's willing to provide that insurance? For short horizons and limited amounts, it exists. Could you do it on a massive scale? I don't know. Louis, you asked about pegs as providing credibility, and you asked about Turkey, and I will not opine about Turkey because certainly there are many people in the room who know a great deal more. But I will use your question to say something about transitions, because everything that we've said today about emerging markets and floating is about sort of regimes in steady state. But if you have high inflation, you have a peg, you have multiple exchange rates, and suddenly you want to transition out of that, do you simply wake up one morning and go for a clean float? And of course, there's a country that begins with A, that is immediately to the east of my country, which will face that choice later on this year. Because our elections late in 2023, everything suggests in Argentina the opposition is going to win. So the center-right will have an opportunity for a second time to get things right. 5 years ago, they got them wrong, and the consequences were not happy. One possible interpretation is that there was probably a mistake on the fiscal side, but on the monetary side, for my own taste, Argentina went to a clean float too quickly. So one can be a believer in floating exchange rates and still understand that from day 0 to day T, where T can be a year or 2 or 3, you may want a partial peg, a crawling peg, some sort of a transition. Exactly what that is, I'm not sure, but you probably need a bit of an anchor. I would not float on day 1. I suspect Pierre-Olivier will confront this question sooner rather than later. You're welcome to throw everything that I just said out the window, or you can invite me for coffee and we can talk about it some more. Last but not least, does intervention work? The number of papers in the JIE that have actually tackled that question probably tends to infinity. I will not try to summarize that literature, but let me give you a policymaker's answer. Does intervention work in smoothing fluctuations at fairly short horizons? No. And would you want it to? Probably not. So maybe that's what Canada was thinking about. I don't think you'll get a lot of traction there. But once or twice a decade, when something terrible happens and your exchange rate seems to be going to the moon, if you stand up there and you say, I happen to have 100 billion here and I'll commit some of that to make sure that the exchange rate doesn't go to the moon, does that have an effect? I think the answer is yes. If you do it once a decade, it works. If you do it once a week, it doesn't. That would be my summary.
Well, let's give a warm round of applause to our panelists for this great session.
My pleasure. Congratulations. Yeah, you absolutely. No, not on. I learned
So I thought. So welcome to the last session. Could everyone take their seats, please? Could everyone take his or her seats, please, and quiet down so we can start? Happy to be moderating session 6. I'm Jeff Frankel, Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you. I'm a little bit worried that going last for our panel, everything that can be said on this general topic has been said in the earlier sessions. It's the hazard of going last, but hopefully we'll come up with some new things to say. I will try to set the stage for this last session briefly. Our title is, Can the Dollar-Based System Be Improved or Replaced? Let me start by admitting that rankings of international currencies by different various criteria can give different answers. We heard yesterday, I think it was from Eshwar, a distinction between the reserve currency and the safe haven currency. It doesn't have to be the same thing. Or a currency in which to hold international reserves, measures of that need not correspond precisely to the currency in which to denominate or invoice trade. And they can give different answers over time. The reserve criterion shows a very slight gradual decline in the dollar's share, as we've seen. While the trade invoicing criterion seems to show that the dollar is still very dominant. Okay. Anyway, these different measures are all pretty highly correlated. And on the big question, they all say the same thing, that the dollar remains a premier international currency by any of the criteria, 50 years after the dollar ceased to be the official anchor or semi-official anchor for the system. Periodically, there are assertions to the contrary. It comes in waves. There was one in 1995. I had a paper in a short article in Foreign Affairs titled The Exaggerated Death of the Dollar, side by side with some others, including Charlie Kindleberger, saying the dollar is going the way of the pesant, which is, I think, an old Turkish Ottoman currency. Anyway, I'm going to pose two big questions for the panel. What currencies are potential challengers to the dollar? All of which we've learned a lot of in previous sessions about. As of 50 years ago, the SDR seemed possible to be a challenger to the dollar, but that has not happened. In the 80s and 90s, it was the Deutschmark and the yen who were beginning to rise in terms of reserve currency shares and other measures, but they never quite reached it. And then more recently, talk about the RMB. And we heard a reference to a paper by Barry Eichengreen and co-authors that say that some smaller currencies, the Australian dollar, Canadian dollar, the Swedish krona, have, by the reserve currency measure, have risen slightly, and that's where the shift out of dollars is going. So anyway, the first question is the rival to the dollars. The second question is, how does a multiple currency system work? Sorry. Multipolar versus unipolar. There are some good reasons to think that a single currency, being the premier international currency, is the efficient and natural solution. It's more efficient to have a single money at the international level rather than a lot of individual currencies, for the same reason that it's more efficient to have a single currency at the national level rather than having a lot of individual currencies traded or the reductio ad absurdum is more efficient than barter. That's why we have money. This is a kind of traditional view, I would say, because of network externalities. It makes more sense to use the currency that everyone else is using. And it predicts inertia in lags between the time that a country acquires the traits desirable for international currency, like economic size and international financial depth and stability, a lag between that and the time that it actually shows up in the rankings. And the traditional view, among others, I would cite Paul Krugman, is that there was something like a 50-year lag between the time that the UK was passed by the US in economic size and the time that the dollar surpassed the pound as a premier international currency. Then there's alternatively what I call a new view I associate with Barry Eichengreen. The network externalities are not as large as we previously believed. Multiple currencies can exist simultaneously. And the way I'd like to think of this is there's a trade-off between the undeniable network externalities, which argue in favor of single currency, versus the alternative on the other side is the danger that the hegemon will abuse the famous exorbitant privilege and encourage other countries to switch to other currencies. We heard yesterday about Giscard and Schmidt setting Europe on the road to the euro, partly in response to their perceived view that the United States was neglecting its role of supplying the international currency that was stable in value. I'm just having trouble with my down. Abusing exorbitant privilege, originally I thought meant excessive budget deficits, money creation, inflation, maybe current account deficits, and the US accelerated greatly the Triffin dilemma by the Vietnam War expansion, as we've heard, inflation resulting from that. But I guess, at least in my thinking, I think most people's were beginning to pay more attention to an alternative way of abusing the exorbitant privilege, which is sanctions. We've heard a lot about this yesterday afternoon, and if the US in particular uses sanctions too often, and especially in cases where it doesn't have support of the international community, it'll encourage, in the current context, Russia and China and others to switch to a new international currency. Although I was struck a bit by Pierre Olivier's recollection of the headlines of 1979, where the sanctions against Iran were already reflected in newspaper headlines as raising the question of whether other countries would shift out of dollars. My last big question is, what about non-currency reserves, of which I have in mind two: gold and cryptocurrencies. We long thought that central bank holdings of gold were an anachronism and didn't really count for the system. But in recent years, or maybe by now it's 2 decades, central banks, especially those in Asia, have gone back to actively buying and selling gold. It counted as their international reserves, even though it's not a current international currency reserve. And there was a nice graph of this that Pierre Olivier gave us at dinner last night, where the bars got to be a lot larger over the last 20 years of central banks buying and selling. Then the last one is cryptocurrencies. For the skeptics of cryptocurrencies, which includes probably most of us in this room, at least speaking for myself, it includes me, I like the question, what is the problem to which a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin is the answer? And we want something better than illegal activity, facilitating illegal activity. So I've seen a paper that's a thesis at Harvard this year, making a better case than I would have expected, that the problem that cryptocurrencies could solve from the viewpoint of some countries is to shift reserves into holding cryptocurrencies if you're a country that was worried on geopolitical grounds that someday the US may apply sanctions to you. And this allows for the fact that the cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, price is going down and it's highly volatile, and it isn't a real thing in my view. But even allowing for all that, there's a case that can be made there that cryptocurrencies might be added to the list. With that, I will turn to our 5 panelists. We've got a panel which is big in quality and big in quantity. I'll introduce them all now. Jeff Frieden is professor of government at Harvard University, works on comparative and international political economy, He is the author of, I'm going to mention 3 books: Currency Politics, The Political Economy of Exchange Rate Policy, #1. #2, Global Capitalism, Its Rise and Fall in the 20th Century. And #3, co-authored with Menzie Chin, Lost Decades. Second panelist, and we'll go in alphabetical order as the other panels have. Linda Goldberg is a financial research advisor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, following a number of previous roles in senior management positions at the New York Fed. She leads various interdisciplinary teams, represents the FRB of New York at the BIS, and so on. Third, Yan Liang Biao, is chief economist for the State Administration of Foreign Exchange of China, that's SAFE, and most of you probably know that SAFE is the largest institutional manager of reserve assets in the world. He previously served as senior advisor to PBOC Governor Yi Gang, and further back, I've learned assistant to Stan Fisher at the Bank of Israel, which is nice to hear. He received his PhD at Princeton. There's a lot of Princeton representation on this panel. Fourth, Helene Ray is professor of economics at the LBS in London Business School. She was at Princeton University on the faculty before moving to London. She received the Benacer Prize for the best European economist under the age of 40, working in macroeconomics and finance under the age of 40, and she's a member of the Financial Stability Committee. Fifth, Yunsong Shin is an economic advisor and head of research of the BIS and co-leads the Monetary and Economic Department while being part of the bank's senior management. He too was a professor of economics at Princeton University and is now at LSE, or then at LSE. So I'll begin with Jeff Frieden. I'm going to use a primitive hand gestures for 3 minutes, 2 minutes, and
take your laptop. Take your laptop so it doesn't fall. Great. Well, thank you very much, Jeff. It's great to be here, and thanks for the invitation. I'm not going to answer any of your 3 questions. In fact, I'm not even going to answer the question I have up there, or that question either. But I am partly because I'm not sure that we would agree on what's wrong, what's right, what should be corrected. As we all know, there are lots of people who believe that one of the main advantages of floating rates is that it allows countries to set their own policies as they wish without taking into consideration what other countries are doing, and there are many people who believe that's the main disadvantage of floating rates. So I'm not quite sure what the normative point here is, but I do want to make the more general analytical point that whatever you think are the problems with the current system, or wherever you think it might or perhaps should go, you will have to take into account the international and domestic politics, because monetary relations are highly politicized, both within countries and across countries. I'm going to focus on what I think are 2 crucially important characteristics of any functioning international or regional monetary arrangement, and that is the provision of monetary stability on the one hand, and the second, a smoothly functioning balance of payments adjustment mechanism. Both of these are highly politically controversial among nations, and they are also politically controversial within nations, largely because following or making or holding to international commitments often conflicts with domestic political commitments. And so I want to try to think a little bit about how these things work, how they've worked in the current system, and what the implications are potentially for the future. Well, first on global monetary stability. Global monetary stability is a public good, then therefore undersupplied in equilibrium. But what typically happens, whether at the international or the regional level, is that it is provided by a country that's big enough to internalize enough of the externalities that it makes sense for it to provide those as an anchor country in return for the privileges, exorbitant or otherwise, that we've heard about, which I think of as, the benefits of being the anchor country. So the U.S. is everybody's friend with benefits. And I won't take that analogy any farther. I'll leave that to you, to what that means about our relations with other countries. But anyway, so why is this accepted? Why is this, there's an implicit or sometimes explicit deal here that the anchor country in making its monetary policy decisions, will at least consider its impact on the rest of the world, the impact of its own policy on the rest of the world. But, as we know, the anchor country has every incentive to take advantage of its privileged position, and sacrificing domestic policy goals to political commitments, international political commitments, can be very, very difficult. So the rest of the world does not vote in American elections, and that makes it hard politically for American administrations to take too much into account what's happening in the rest of the world or the implications of its policies for the rest of the world. It requires that the government or the Fed ignore political pressures and to put the country first, which may democratically be the right thing to do. There might be counter support for more internationalist policies, but remember that even in the glory days of American internationalism in the immediate period after World War II, support for America's leading role in the world, including in international monetary relations, was not sold on the basis of its economic benefits to the US, but on the basis of its national security implications. So it's a difficult sell to ask people in the United States, or any country for that matter, to sacrifice substantially on behalf of this vague notion of international cooperation or global monetary stability or our relations with our allies. And that has been borne out in example after example. I think of the end of Bretton Woods, when American monetary policy is inconsistent with the monetary policy preferences of our partners and allies. And the Nixon administration was well aware of this, of course. I always remember the story told many times now about Burns telling Nixon many times, including at Camp David, that the US economy needed to be cooled off, and Nixon responding, remembering 1960, he blamed the Fed for having lost the 1960 election because it had implemented a slightly recessionary policy in the run-up to the election. Nixon said, yeah, we cooled off the economy, and we cooled off 60 congressmen and 15 senators in the presidency, and I'm not going to do that again. So the end of Bretton Woods is a sterling example, well, bad example, sterling example anyway, of the potential contradiction between the needs of American policymakers who have to get reelected, and of the people that are electing them, and the needs of their responsibilities to the rest of the world. The EMS crisis I think of as very much the same. Germany is unified. The German authorities are concerned about the inflationary impact of the fiscal bump that implies, and so they dramatically increase interest rates in Germany at a time when many countries in the EMS were already facing high unemployment, and so you have a complete inconsistency between the monetary policy of the anchor, Germany in this case, and the monetary policy preferences of the rest of the EMS, and the EMS blows up as a result. So to me, these are examples of domestic politics trumping international commitments. I use that word advisedly. So second consideration, a balance of payments adjustment mechanism. Now, the smooth functioning of a balance of payments adjustment mechanism, of course, requires actual adjustment. And adjustment is difficult. Adjustment is politically difficult because it requires, again, sacrifice. And we know from many, many experiences that the burden of adjustment, or the allocation of the burden of adjustment, is a completely distributional question, both among countries and within countries. Much of the politics of international financial relations and international monetary relations has to do with debates over how that burden of adjustment will be allocated among countries and within countries. There are two asymmetries in the adjustment burden. One that we or at least I learned as an undergraduate in economics. The first asymmetry is the asymmetry between surplus and deficit countries. Surplus countries are not under the kind of pressure to adjust that deficit countries or debtors are. And in the current environment, there seems to be a seemingly unlimited willingness on the part of the surplus countries to suppress consumption in order to maintain the surpluses they have. The other asymmetry is one that I think was not so obvious, at least when I was an undergraduate, and seems more obvious, or at least more striking now, which is that the anchor country, in the US in this case, does not seem to be under any substantial pressure to adjust, because there seems to be a seemingly unlimited appetite for a safe asset, or for safe assets. All of this raises significant questions, I think, with the functioning or the non-functioning of a balance of payments adjustment mechanism. Now, of course, there are many countries that do have to adjust, but the fact that the surplus countries don't seem to be willing and really find it necessary, and that the reserve country doesn't seem to find it necessary, I think raises a question about the future of the system. The adjustment is domestically painful and politically costly. Why do it? If you don't have to, why do it? Again, the examples of the end of Bretton Woods, which would have required adjustment on the part of the US, and the Eurozone debt crisis, which I think is the more recent area in which a relatively straightforward and simple debt crisis, which could have been solved, I think, quite simply, was held up for years and years and years because the member states of the Eurozone could not agree on how to allocate the adjustment burden among debtor and creditor nations, and how, in some sense, how the governments themselves couldn't agree on how to allocate the burden of adjustment within their countries politically. So all of this, I think, leads to a question about whether the adjustment mechanism is working. And I know not everyone here will agree, because I've talked with Jeff about it, but I'm of the school that large and sustained imbalances are a formula for economic problems, financial crises, but also political conflict. So I think that this is a problem. Well, can the world do better? I don't know. I think better in terms of internalizing the externalities or agreeing on the adjustment burden. I think the situation that we face today, at least as I think about it, and no offense to Linda, this is the goal of monetary stability in some sense, especially for peripheral countries, is undermined by the fact that the Fed has this very specific mandate and it's American. And that's perhaps appropriate, but it does create problems for the rest of the world. I think the goal of a smoothly functioning balance of payments adjustment mechanism is undermined by the fact that some of the major members of the system really are not under major pressure to adjust, and even if they were, are almost certainly unwilling to do so. So can we do better? I think, sure, normatively, we could probably do better. But I think the real question is positively, that is there a Pareto improvement? Is there an improvement available that would be politically acceptable? And that, I think, depends on domestic politics. What it implies to me is that the domestic political realities within the major players, their willingness or ability to sacrifice something at the domestic level to encourage, maintain, sustain, increase international collaboration is in question. Right now, it's hard to find a lot of domestic political support for undertaking difficult economic measures solely because of their international implications. We all have seen how the attempt to get international commitments through an unwilling domestic politics can often backfire. So I am not optimistic that we will be particularly successful at getting countries to undertake major reforms in the international monetary system unless there are substantial pressures to do so, which are politically internalized by the major political players within domestic politics. But the main message I would say is, if you want to understand the future of international monetary relations, look at domestic politics, especially among the major players, because that's where it's going to be determined. I need my phone, especially since it's going to go off.
So good to be here. I want to say I'm speaking on my own behalf and not on behalf of the entire United States history, Federal Reserve, Bank of New York, or Federal Reserve System. So we heard a lot about dollar liquidity and global liquidity flows and the safety net. So I'm just going to dig deep on that topic. And we could dig deeper in the discussion if you like. So the starting point here is, for my exposition is going to be 2020 and what happened in global dollar funding markets. And then I'm going to introduce the types of facilities that the Federal Reserve has. And then I'll talk about some evidence on what those facilities seem to have been achieving. And of course, any type of evidence on any topic, looking at the period from February 2020 through the next months that followed, are complicated by all of the things that happen in the world. So these are indicative, but they're not conclusive. So what happened to global dollar funding markets in March? So we all know that if you just think about supply and demand for dollars, there was a reduced supply of dollars to funding markets. So lenders who normally would have supplied these dollars held on to their dollars as precautionary holdings amid economic and financial disruption. So their response to uncertainty, and there was a lot of uncertainty. So at the same time, you had this reduction in the supply of dollars. You had an increase in demand for dollars, and that's for funding purposes and hedging purposes. So for example, looking at data for regulatory data in the United States at foreign bank branches in the United States, we could see that some of the foreign banks in the United States faced big drawdowns on their committed credit lines. And so they had to meet these draws on their committed credit lines, so extend loans essentially through that. And at the same time that they had to fund this need that just came onto their balance sheet, they had reduced access to other funding sources because credit markets had dried up. So actually, the US branches of foreign banks sourced more net liquidity from their parents. That's the regime that the world is in at this point with kind of branch and parent relationships. And that meant that parents, whether they were in Japan or Switzerland or Europe, had to come up with more dollars. Dollar funding costs rose, and you could go into the market and get those dollars at these stress conditions. But if swap lines were in place, the parents could instead draw on the swap lines for getting these dollars instead of getting new funding from private markets. So in March 2020, the FOMC put in place a number of actions to address dollar funding strains. So just dialing back for a second, before March 2020, there were a number of things that took place in the global financial crisis around the kind of extension, development of swap lines, and then some refinements over the kind of structure in place over the years that followed. But in March 2020, the terms for getting dollars through these swap lines, this is a backstop facility, so the terms in general are worse than market terms because that's the whole point of a backstop. The terms were eased with the standing central bank counterparties, there are 5, and that included reducing the swap pricing spread to OIS plus 25 basis points from 50 basis points, adding 84-day operations because it was observed that at that tenor, that was where a lot of funding strains were taking place, and then increasing the frequency of operations to daily. They extended the temporary swap lines with 9 other central banks, and they also introduced, importantly, a new facility called the Foreign and International Monetary Authority, a FEMA repo facility, which I'm just putting 5 up there, which allows a broader range of foreign official entities to obtain dollar repo against their treasury holdings in accounts at the Federal Reserve. So just also, new, throwing in here last weekend, we had also actions around the swap lines. And with these standing central banks, the frequency of dollar operations moved from weekly to daily. So that was just last weekend. Now, what are the concepts here? And this speaks a little bit to what Jeff was just talking about. So in terms of how I laid this out, it allows commercial banks outside the US to access US dollar liquidity that obviates the need for them to build up market rates excessively. It avoids fire sales of dollar assets that might be used for dollar liquidity. If banks don't have to fire sale their assets, whether those banks are abroad or in the United States, that means that they could continue their provision of credit in their local economies, as well as in the United States, where they're kind of funding different types of commercial activities. And it also lets the these banks have access to dollars and therefore continue to intermediate dollars to other financial as well as non-financial institutions. So Shebnam brought up the corporates as well. For some central banks, they would not be selling off their foreign exchange reserves to kind of provide this liquidity. And some central banks also draw on these dollar swap lines and then re-intermediate essentially to other central banks. So in some work with colleagues, we looked at whether the conjectures around what these facilities do seem to be supported in data. And I want to point to two main ideas. One is reducing strains in markets of the types that I described. The other is a general issue, and I talked about this at the Mundell-Fleming lecture as well, but the general issue that global liquidity flows are highly responsive to risk sentiment and to risk events. So what can you do systemically to reduce the sensitivity of international flows to risk conditions and risk events? So if the facilities actually can have a reassuring role, then you might not have this extra demand for liquidity for bringing that onto your own balance sheets in this stress period. So that in of itself could be helpful. So we saw that countries with access to these facilities did have reduced costs of dollar borrowing in foreign exchange swap markets. When the FEMA repo facilities were activated by countries, so this was new, and for some countries, they went into effect as soon as they got the mechanisms in place in April. Others, it took a little bit longer to get that going, up to the countries. After those were in place, it also had some of this decline in strains. Both types of facilities in empirical work were associated with reduced sensitivity of funding costs and funding flows to VIX and risk sentiment measures. It didn't really have an effect on equity flows across countries. The evidence also is that if you look at cross-border flows through banks, they did not collapse following the pandemic shock. This was different than the global financial crisis. So the banking flows, credit flows domestically and internationally, the evidence seems to suggest were supported with these facilities and risk sensitivity of flows declined. Last slide. I just gave a very optimistic assessment. Of course, we've heard already that that's not a global financial stability or a safety net. Can the dollar-based system be improved or replaced? Okay, so the international roles of the dollar engage with flexible exchange rates. They engage with rapid flows of liquidity across border. They also engage with frictions in intermediating liquidity, and this kind of focus on frictions has been a big part of the literature since the global financial crisis. And, you know, we have the backstops aiming to mitigate the effects of systemic strains on the supply of credit to households and businesses, the real economy. At the end of the day, you know, that's what you're looking for. But I think we could continue to look at types of things like Pierre-Olivier discussed, although I would say that, you know, we could talk about whether the parts of that work and don't work from last night, but really what's the speed, magnitude, and pass-through of this backstop dollar liquidity to all of the places where it's needed? How do you adjust facilities, terms, scope to match the evolving structure and character of financial intermediaries? So for example, there are many more non-bank financials, and they only get that credit after it's intermediated by banks, and you know, looking at different facilities as we did with introducing the FEMA repo that have different types of restrictions and access to use. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I want to begin by thank Maurice, Doug, and of course Adam and PIIE for having me here. It's my first trip in 3.5 years. So it's very pleased to see many friends. You know, today my talk is on whether the dollar system can be improved or replaced. Actually, I took a step back. I tried to understand what happened to the dollar system. And, you know, yesterday we discussed a lot of what have happened to the global financial system or to the, monetary system. The essential conclusion is that it seems that we have different names. Jamaica system, we have Bretton Woods 2.0, and then we even have Bretton Woods 3.0. But the basic conclusion is that it's a dollar system, which has never changed, right? Richard mentioned, it's a symmetric system. I think, a big change to me happened in 2018. I wrote a project syndicate op-ed in 2019 March, where I said China had a quiet central banking revolution, by which I refers to the renminbi depegged from the dollar or move towards a clean floating renminbi. But I won't talk too much about that. I'm happy to answer questions or explain during Q&A. And today, since I think I would introduce something I worked last month while I was still with SAFE, but I transited to a new role to CICC. So I didn't. The work was done with SAFE, but I'm presenting here, so I didn't affiliate with anybody. I would rather just, it's more about the material I present. So what have happened to the global financial system? The big question I'm trying to understand, are we indeed moving into a bipolar world, as many seems to suggest? The tool I use is a workhorse gravity model. Richard and Elaine worked on that. Of course, I have learned this from Elaine's class 20 years ago in Princeton. Of course, you can look at the raw data, right, with the trade going up or or finance going down. But the thing is, if you look at the raw data, it may give you a very distorted picture. Korea and Japan still trade more with China than the US. Same for Brazil and Chile, they trade more with the US than China. But if you control for economic weight and geographic proximity, you get actually a different picture. What I refer to here called excess intensity. You will see that Japan and China now, after controlling for gravity factors, they trade more with the US, while Brazil and Chile trade more with China. And this is actually even more pronounced on financial flows. So I look at, we have 45 countries, 22 years of data. We apply, trade, bond flow, equity flow, and FDI flow to each country bilaterally, and investigate whether their bilateral trade and the flow relationship has changed with China and in the United States. What we found is this division. On trade, countries remain very resilient, trading with China, but on financial flows, particularly equity flows, many advanced economies, even some emerging economies, decreased their flow to China, but sharply increased to the United States. So this is my, broad picture. I fear this trade and the finance disconnect is very worrisome because, there's two outcomes out of this, right? One is you can see financial flows, maybe they have overreacted. And if it's overreacted, they can reconnect. And if they see, we have increasingly, eggs in one basket, they can reconnect by moving back to emerging markets into China. This outcome one. But there's also another outcome, as literature seems to suggest. trade flow and the financial flows are complements to each other. And then if you don't have the lubricant of the monetary system, trade flow will deteriorate. And then we will move to a very fractured bipolar world. That's very worrisome. So I want to give you some details. Let's see first on trade flows. I know that the tables, the charts here are very small. I will try. The blue line is bilateral excess trade with China. This is for Europe, Germany, and this is Japan, United Kingdom, United States. You see, the European countries they still trade a lot with China. It's not affected by US-China trade war. The red dotted line in 2018. Though US and China trade reduced a bit, however, it also rebounded from 2019 to 2021, a lost data point in 2021. This is trade for advanced economy. On emerging economy, you can see that Brazil, Malaysia, Poland, in the Middle East country, they trade a lot more, significantly more with China. So it's this result is very robust. So trade seems to be resilient, maybe reflecting China still has a very comprehensive manufacturing capacity. The surprising part, I think, is on the equity flow. If we apply the same method, you see 2018 seems to be a breaking point. Germany, Japan, even UK, they all significantly increased equity flows to the United States. US equity flow to China sharply dropped. On the emerging economy, we see a more subtle picture. Brazil, the increased flow to US, but not as expensive of China equity flow. South Korea, they increased a lot of flow to the US. Flows to China actually decreased. So this is on equity. I don't show here on FDI flows. FDI flows show a similar pattern that decoupling seems to happen, especially for traditional US allies. They move to US, but it's not as pronounced as equity flow, maybe because it's hard to change overnight. So that's on the financial side. Now, there are some hypotheses about why we have this equity or financial reshifting. Our hypothesis here is that maybe it's because of China-US trade frictions. So we have this geopolitical tensions. Pierre talked about it last night on geopolitical fragmentation. What I called here is geopolitical repricing. There is, however, another hypothesis. If you talk to financial industry people, they will tell you that because the U.S. equities simply offer better returns, so they move to the U.S. mostly out of pure economic reason. Of course, if you have more flows, maybe on the short term you actually get a higher return, and then higher return, we have this wealth effect feedback to a booming economy, so it can be sustained for quite some time. Now, how we compare these two different hypotheses? I did two things here. One is on the left, I just decomposed equity return to three parts: risk-free rate, equity risk premium, and earnings growth. And then you can see here, this is the equity risk premium component of China index, the red line, and SP 500 is the blue line. You can see whether it's for 2018, that's the China-US trade frictions, or it's for 2022, it's Russian-Ukraine conflict. The US equity risk premium didn't move much, actually reduced during 2022. But China's equity risk premium jumped a lot. So this seems to give some evidence that we are actually, indeed there is a geopolitical risk pricing there. Another sort of experiment I did is trying to regress inflows on public opinion. We have Gallup poll that we just compare how much was the ratio favoring China against not favoring China, and you regress the flows on the public opinion poll. You also find that it seems that flows to China are heavily influenced by public opinion, why flows to the US are not affected by public opinion. This is happened, during the Trump administration. Public opinion towards the US dropped in Europe, and yet flows continue to US from Europe. I only have 1 minute, so I will conclude here by the final slide. I mentioned in the beginning that, to me, floating rates is only at 5 because China really allowed the currency to almost clean floating 5 years ago. That, I think, is fundamental to different asset returns, which gives a new asset, a new class of asset to diversify. You can see US and Europe bond flow return, their bond returns are highly correlated, but the US and China bonds, they are not correlated at all, except during the big shock, pandemic shock. The reason is very easy to understand. Last year, the US hiked 425 bips, and the China cut policy rate 3 times. So the bond rates are a natural diversifier these days. Even on equity flows, the orange lines, US with European equities, they basically move close, almost one-on-one, like 0.6, 0.7 positive correlation. But Chinese equity correlation with the US is very low. So my bottom line is that I think there are different ways to provide stability to the international monetary system. There can be swap line networks, but also there can be more cross-border financial flows, especially equity flows that are, a natural hedge against shocks. So maybe there could be more equity flows towards China, given that they're much less co-movement with each other since China has gone clean floating. I will leave it here. Thank you very much.
So it has been a great pleasure to hear more about the last 50 years and how we took a big leap in the unknown in 1971-73 into a different type of monetary system, and also to hear more about how we have been doing ever since. In my little intervention here, I'm going to try to tackle one of the questions that Jeff has actually put to us, which was the issue of multipolarity versus unipolarity of the international monetary system. And for that, I will start by going back to Charlie Kindleberger and his discussion of Britain and sterling in the 19th century, where he pointed out that hegemonic situations have some advantages in terms of provision of public goods. And what are the public goods that can be provided by a hegemon in the international monetary system? Well, a market for distressed goods provided by British free trade, a countercyclical flow of capital provided by the City of London, coordination of macroeconomic policies and exchange rates, that was under the gold standard, and a lender of last resort in the Bank of England. Now, of course, the dollar-based system is different in many respects. However, you could say that there are also lots of public goods provisions that are provided by the new hegemon, the public goods provided by the US and the dollar, in particular the ability to provide safe assets in bad times, to provide liquidity, this time, of course, the Fed being the lender of last resort, to be an importer of last resort. And we have more issues with, or equally challenging issues, maybe with lack of coordination of exchange rates and macroeconomic policies. However, maybe, and we had a very illuminating panel, I think, just before this one, on the importance in this kind of gray trilemma-dilemma world, I would say, of additional tools in order to help us manage macroeconomic policies, whether we think about the capital flow management or the macroprudential policies, which I think are taking more and more importance and are extremely important on the side of demand management possibly, but financial stability certainly. And I think that's a very important new development. Now, I'm going to go here for the French touch, evidently, because this has been a tradition here. So what does this dollar-centric system provide? So liquidity provision, and Linda reminded us also about the importance of the swap lines, and that's clearly a characteristic of a new system. The safe asset provision, so there we can see it in particular in bad times, with the flight to quality, the dollar appreciation in bad times. And the provision of safe asset is linked, and this is also a point that Maurice has emphasized repeatedly, it's linked to good governance. So from the fiscal backup side, monetary policy, regulation, institutions, it's also linked to the fact that in order to be a large safe asset provider, evidently you need very broad, deep, and flexible financial markets. And of course, this is something that de Gaulle repeatedly talked about in the 1960s, and had this resentful way of the dollar, which was not only an international means of exchange, but also a way of issuing credit for the United States that everybody would be willing to provide because of this safe asset role. And the word exorbitant privilege came from his administration and Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and and several people, we revived it and described the exorbitant privilege of the US as the ability of the US essentially to issue safe assets on the external sides, which would be demanded by the rest of the world in large quantities, and the ability of investing in riskier assets on the other side of the balance sheets, thereby providing an excess return on the external balance sheet of the United States. So the exorbitant privilege, in exchange, obviously, for this insurance, this safe asset provision, which is an insurance for the rest of the world, since the rest of the world accumulates a lot of safe assets, safe dollar assets, and the dollar appreciates in bad time, partly because of the coordination of the dollar being a safe asset. Then when you have bad global shocks, what's happening is that on the asset side of the balance sheet of the United States, you have a massive decline of valuations. And on the liability side, you have an improvement, and that triggers a wealth transfer, which is an insurance transfer to the rest of the world. So this is the exorbitant duty. This is really what an insurer does. So in order to model that, one can think of models in which you are going to generate this if the United States is a country which is less risk averse than the rest of the world, and therefore will insure the rest of the world. Why would it be less risk averse? There could be cultural issues. There could be simply the efficiency of US financial markets, which could be asymmetric compared to the rest of the world, and that shows up as risk aversion being less high for the US as a kind of parameter in a macro model that you can play with. The point is, the insurance transfer happens in bad times, so it's times where marginal utility of consumption is very high. So this is really an insurance capacity here that is provided by the dollar and the US. Now, the problem that was alluded to also by Pierre-Olivier yesterday was we are in a world where the size of the hegemon is shrinking. The economic size of the hegemon is shrinking compared to the rest of the world. Now, we all can see that even if a country like Luxembourg has a good governance and good fiscal policies and good regulation, it would probably not be a good provider of safe assets for the rest of the world. Size matters, and the size of the fiscal backing matters in relation to the stock of safe assets in the world economy. And therefore, as the size of the hegemon shrinks in the world economy, we may see two consequences. The natural one is that the price of safe assets goes up, so the real rate goes down. And the hegemons becomes more leveraged, providing a larger demand for safe assets from the rest of the world, itself shrinking. So that also means that the wealth transfers in bad times tend to become larger compared to the size of the hegemon. And this may put into question the credibility of a fiscal backstop, of the safety of the assets. So this is possibly a new Triffin dilemma, or new Triffin dilemma, taking my French accent here, since after all, Triffin was Belgium. Now, therefore, in a world like that, with a vanishing hegemon, one can think of a natural solution, which is to switch to multipolarity, to have several, so not quite hegemons, but several important asset providers that would help diversify the supply of safe assets, that would deal to some extent with a fiscal backing issue. So maybe that would be a way of overcoming the Neutrophil dilemma. Of course, there would be some decrease in inefficiency, because here I have focused on really the safe asset and liquidity side of things, but we all know that the international role of the dollar relies on many complementarities in its different functions, something that Peter Kennan never failed to emphasize with a very nice table that I didn't produce here, but where he always had all the different functions, the medium of exchange functions, the function as a reserve currency, the function as a vehicle currency, and showing how all these functions interact. And in the medium of exchange function, there is an externality a medium of exchange externality, which is strong, which means that if you go to a multipolar world, you are going to decrease efficiency in many different respects of these different currency roles, in particular everything that has to do with exchange, but this interacts with exchange rate risk and a lot of other things. But more maybe importantly, maybe if you go to a multipolar world, well, then you need other countries with broad, deep, transparent financial markets able to absorb these large savings imbalances that the US has been able to absorb. Some people have commented a lot on this yesterday. And so that requires effectively a kind of change in economic and financial structure for countries who would be also providing some safe assets in a large scales for the rest of the world. And we don't have that currently, we don't have that. Now, there are also some dangers of multipolarity, which from an economic theory point of view are quite straightforward. If you have different provider of safe assets, that means you are making some currencies more substitutable with one another. And if you have more substitutability, you might have larger portfolio shift, less stable equilibria. In particular, credibility shocks might be more destabilizing because now you have a closer substitute. So if you have a credibility shock, that may decrease the stability of a system. And in a multipolar system, of course, if it goes together like the type of geopolitical issues that we have been discussing as well, we are going to have more issues of credibility and trust, and providing liquidity in bad times depends on the credibility of institutions, the trust, etc. So this is something in short supply in a more fragmented world and a more multipolar world. So now, having underlined the issues between, I hope, unipolarity and multipolarity, we just want to focus my last slides on a particular issue that I think is linked to the current system that we have, which is definitely in need of reforms. If we look at the current flows of capital, they tend to reflect empirically two global factors. One is a global financial cycle, financial conditions being more or less risk on, risk off, and leading to more transactions internationally. And the second one is the global commodity cycle, which is also linked with the trade cycle. Now, these two cycles are lots of links with the dollar, the Fed playing an important role in the global financial cycle, but also commodity markets in dollars playing an important role also in the second cycle. And what we are witnessing is the incapacity of this existing international financial system to channel capital, where now we would have high marginal social value, that is to say, to channel capital to deal with climate and biodiversity loss mitigation. So we all know that we need a lot of capital to flow in order to deal with climate change in particular. And what the financial engineering within the dollar-centric system that we have seen so far, what the financial engineering has done is that it has not dealt at all with this type of issues. We have seen an elastic supply of safe assets or quasi-safe assets in dollars between the 2000 and 2008, based on creating a lot of market-backed securities, CDO squares based on real estate product, in a way that was a way of increasing the supply of dollar-safe or quasi-safe assets, okay, and that was demanded by the rest of the world. But this type of financial engineering has absolutely not done anything to improve the allocation of capital towards dealing with a climate change issue. And I think if we are thinking about reforms here within the current system, there are different types of financial engineering, like de-risking the investment for climate change, using the balance sheet of international financial institutions, Bretton Woods created institutions in particular, that should be considered and scaled up. I mean, there are already quite a few examples of blended finance, which seem to be going in the right direction, but obviously they are not at scale. And so I would argue that we need to rewire essentially the type of financial flows that is created by the dollar-centric system by doing different financial engineering. And I will stop on that.
It's really a great pleasure to be here, and I've learned so much over these 2 days, and it's a fantastic program. I'd like to close off the proceedings, and I am the last speaker, I think, to reorient the discussion somewhat towards the financial system. So far we've talked very much about the international monetary system in all its different aspects. But I want to broaden that discussion a bit to the international or the global financial system as a whole. And what I'll do is to follow on from Linda's presentation and look at it through the lens of FX swaps. So why would FX swaps be interesting for this purpose? Well, it gives you a sense of how globally interconnected the various players are. And at its most basic, a swap is where I give you one currency, you give me dollars, and we wrap it up in an agreement that we will reverse those, reverse those flows at a pre-agreed exchange rate at some pre-agreed time. So it's a very, very simple transaction. So you give me yen, I give you dollars, and we promise to reverse that transaction at a certain point in time at a fixed exchange rate. So why might that be important? Well, and useful? Well, the textbook cases have very much to do with hedging. So if I'm an exporter and I'm just going to, it's highly likely that I will get an export order, but my costs are in local currency. So what I like to do is to lock in whatever the money that I'll be receiving in dollars so that I can hedge my risks. So that's a very, very typical textbook example of how you would use an FX swap to hedge currency risk. Now, it's turned out that, of course, the dollar is a very important part of the story in the FX swap market. And it's a very, very large part of the financial system. And how do we know that? Well, every 3 years, the BIS conducts a survey of all FX, of the FX market, both through the instruments, the major sectors, and the financial centers, where these transactions take place. This is why we call it the triennial survey, and we do it in partnership with our central bank members. So typically we would work with 50 plus central banks. We would do a very detailed stock take of all transactions and have a snapshot of the stocks at a particular moment in time. We've had this triennial survey since the 80s. And one way to think about the way that FX swaps have really become important is to scale it by global GDP. So let's look at the flows first. So if we look at the flows, the daily FX turnover, so this is every day, the turnover every day of various foreign currency transactions measured as a proportion of world GDP, of world GDP, which is on an annual basis, has trended like this. So if you look at currencies other than the dollar, it's been very stable. So here we have the euro, which is the yellow line. It's gone up a little bit since the euro was launched. But if we look at the yen, the sterling and the Swiss franc, it's really been very stable. So as economic activity has grown, so has FX swap or foreign exchange activity in terms of flows in these other currencies. The one exception is the dollar, which is the green line. So that's gone up. So even as a proportion of world GDP, that has grown really very substantially. The dotted line is the total. And so the dollar accounts for the lion's share of FX transactions. So here's a useful little fact for you to bear in mind for your next presentation, which is that roughly every 15 days, the daily transactions, so if you just add up 15 days worth of daily transactions, that's equivalent to world GDP. What about the stocks? So these are the flows. What about the stocks? And here, let me focus in very much on the swap market because we have the spot transactions, then we have the options transactions. Those are, of course, important, but it turns out that it's the swap market that really is the key to understanding the FX markets and some of the financial factors that we've been discussing over the last 2 days. So as a proportion of world GDP, the amount of FX swaps where the dollar is on one end of that swap has grown in this way, as the green line shows. It has grown to over 80% of world GDP. So that's the stock. And you see the dotted line, which is the global total. It's again the lion's share of the FX swap market. What about the swaps that has the euro, the yen, Swiss franc, sterling on one side? Again, as with the flows, it's been very, very stable. Now, why has the green line gone up like this? I think one of the, so there are two issues here. One is, why is the green line so high relative to the others, which is about the dominance of the dollar. The second is, why has it trended up? I think that's probably, that needs a little bit more thought. Because I think on the dollar dominance, we've discussed it really at length over these 2 days. It has to do with the network effects that Hélène also mentioned, which is, if you have dollar invoicing, it means that you probably need working capital in dollars. So you borrow short-term in dollars from banks. And that means that there is dollar debt due to the invoicing. On the other hand, if you have, let's say, oil or other commodities which are priced in dollars, and you need to make a capital investment, it also probably makes sense to borrow in dollars because you're eliminating one of many sources of risk if you can at least eliminate the currency risk. So from the point of view of the capital markets, it means that there is a preponderance of dollar debt because people have borrowed in dollars. And so if you're an investor and you're looking out there, there is a lot of dollar-denominated securities. And so if you are a long-term investor in a rich country outside the United States, say that you're running a pension fund or a life insurance company, you're looking at a lot of dollar-denominated securities. And if you're a very rich country, probably there aren't enough securities in your home market of enough diversity for you to fill up your balance sheet because your balance sheet is very large. So typically for those investors, they will have a global. So their assets will be a slice of the global asset offering. And so dollar-denominated securities will be a very, very important part of that. Now, in this respect, also, and Andres talked about original sin, it turns out that even so corporates tend to borrow in dollars when they borrow from abroad. And that's true whether you're an emerging market borrower or an advanced economy borrower. And there is this very interesting paper by Majori, Neyman, and Schrager, which shows that you have this very much a dollar-focused borrowing by corporate borrowers. Now, of course, that's not the end of the story, because if you're a life insurance company or a pension fund, you have dollar assets, but your obligations to your policyholders, to your beneficiaries, are in your own currency. So you need to hedge. And how do you hedge? Well, this is where the swaps come in. The swaps are extremely important because it allows financial institutions to really play a very big role in the global market itself. And you can see how every piece of this puzzle fit together and they reinforce each other. What this chart shows us then is also that financial players are playing a much more important role in the FX swap market. So the yellow here is the non-financial customers of FX swaps, again, measured as a proportion of world GDP. And that's been very constant. And if you look at world trade, which grew very rapidly until roughly the great financial crisis, it's really sort of flatlined since then. And the yellow portion gives you a very sort of good take on the size of global trade. So the real world use of hedging really is small, as you can see, relative to the financial uses, and it's been very stable. The big shift has been the financial use of the FX swap market. The red line here, just as a comparison, is the reporting dealers portion. So this is the intermediation activity that's associated with the banking sector that actually buys and sells this stuff and provides it. But the comparison that we should really look at is the non-financial use and the financial use. And these are, so when I say other financial institutions, this means non-bank. Now, there is a debate which we've contributed to, which has to do with the question, do FX swaps constitute debt of some kind? And we had a paper in the December quarterly review when we published the latest triennial survey, which made an argument that FX swaps have very debt-like attributes. So what's the argument? Well, let me give you the counter-argument first. So what's the argument for saying it's not debt? Well, in terms of the accounting, it's a very simple accounting exercise. So one day before the swap, I have euros as cash on the asset side of my balance sheet. After the swap, I just find myself with dollars on the asset side of the balance sheet. The balance sheet size has not changed. It's simply a switching of one item. So there's no increase in my balance sheet. There's nothing on the liability side. And therefore, this is the way that, this is the way that some people would argue this is not debt. It's purely a switching of one of the items on the asset side. And of course, contractually, FX swaps are symmetric. So, I give you dollars, you give me yen. That's symmetric. And if I have a debt to you, then you have a debt to me. So it's completely symmetric. But economically, as we heard yesterday, in those states of the world where you are looking to repay the dollars and everyone else is looking to repay the dollars, that's the state of the world when any disruptions to financial conditions will have the biggest impact. And when we look at episodes like March 2020 that Linda spoke about, it's in those episodes where you're scrambling for dollars that you see that there is an asymmetry in the economics, even though contractually FX swaps are symmetric. And that is that there is an advantage to having dollars rather than having to owe dollars. And we see that priced out in particular in the spread of FX swaps over money market rates. In other words, you can compare the interest rate on the dollar in the FX swap market with the interest rate on the dollar in the money markets, and typically they're not the same. You pay more for borrowing dollars in the FX swap market than you do in the dollar money market. And that so-called FX swap spread, or CIP deviation, fluctuates quite substantially depending on financial conditions. And it's one other example of the risk premium fluctuations that Shebnam talked about yesterday. Now, if you believe that there is something to that story, so there is a debt-like element, you'd be interested to know that this is not something that is actually compiled or even measured. Well, we measure it, but it's not measured as debt, and the size is very substantial. So if you look at the quarterly review, the estimates that, and it's a very simple calculation from this kind of figure, the debt-like element for non-US, so non-banks outside the United States, I should say, is around $25 trillion. And for non-US banks, it's about $35 trillion. And that's actually substantially larger than the formal on-balance sheet amounts that we also publish. And it does actually pose a very interesting question on how we think about the financial system as a way to cushion shocks, as a way to foster globalization. And Linda's presentation, I think, was very, very important in that regard, in that the importance of central bank swap lines lies very much in making sure that this short-term demand for dollars that comes up, this debt-like demand for dollars that come up from time to time, is actually something that can be met and will not disrupt broader economic activity. If you look at the longer version of the slide deck that I sent to Jeff, you'll see that I have a little illustration of how that would work. But I think this corner of the financial system is big, it's important, and I think for this conference, I would think that it's very appropriate to close with this, with this particular topic, and I'll hand it back to Jeff.
So I'd like to thank all 5 panelists, ask them all to come up to take their place. I think we want the name tag. While they're getting seated, I will note that they did succeed in covering territory that doesn't overlap that much with the rest. Fred, you have something urgent? Well, let me. Jeff Frieden said the domestic politics are paramount. Linda Goldberg looked at the March 2020 event, the dollar funding strain. Yan Liang Miao talked about a disconnect between trade and finance. Helen Ray looked at the tension or the contest between a unipolar dollar system versus a multipolar system. And Hyung Song Shin looked at everything through the lens of foreign exchange swaps. I was gonna ask each of the panelists, maybe in reverse order, starting off with Hyung Song, to say anything more they had to say or comment on what anyone else said. And after they've each had a chance to speak, we'll throw it up to the audience. Fred, you just be waiting to make a comment later? Yeah, I think we'll first give them a chance to make any.
Well, actually, Chef, we had the so we had the benefit of seeing each other's slides actually. So I can skip my turn.
Len?
No, so actually, a question for Yoon. I mean, the position you show for these swaps are gross positions, not net, right? So it's not so clear to me that you should assimilate them as additional dollar debt, but you do have both sides.
The problem with the swap line, as Jeffrey mentioned, is not a unified global swap line. It's almost, there's not enough interconnectedness there. Just one comment, yes.
So I wanted to get back to Alain's point on the world having a problem, which is that the size of the hegemon is shrinking relative to the rest of the world. And so, I spoke about the swaps and the FEMA repo. We've had a lot of conversations on the swap. The FEMA repo basically ties into the foreign exchange reserve component, and it basically is one way of liquefying but not liquidating foreign exchange reserves in a stress event. And that is a broad-based facility, assuming that there are accounts that are held at the Federal Reserve. And it basically, you can possibly think about it as delivering a more elastic supply of dollar liquidity at stress moments. But I do want to point out something that we haven't talked very much about, which is, and I hinted at, but thinking about not just the structures on the supply of liquidity side, but also about reducing the demand for liquidity. And this is when I started talking about reducing risk sensitivity of flows. I was kind of going a little bit in that direction, which is on the banking side, regulation and supervision should be strengthening financial institutions, so kind of supporting that reduced demand for liquidity. There's a whole agenda that's there for non-bank financial institutions, and insurance and pension funds came up, but it's broader. You had mentioned, having more assets in equity. That's also something to consider. So I think there's a whole additional space on not just thinking about meeting the demand for liquidity, but also meeting the demand for liquidity, but also reducing that demand for liquidity.
All I would say, I thought the presentations were really fascinating, and Alain's and Linda's in particular, relevant to the political economy issues that I keep harping on, perhaps ad nauseum. But whether it's because the U.S. is shrinking in size or for other reasons, there is increasing reticence, and I would say even hostility on the part of many in the United States, including in Congress, to extending. Listen, there's hostility to the Fed acting as lender of last resort within the United States, and the Fed or the U.S. acting as anything like a lender of last resort internationally has already in the 1990s experience and will undoubtedly be a political football. So I just wanted to flag that as a political economy implication of some of these issues.
All right. Let me just note that the U.S. is not shrinking in size. The rest of the world has increased in economic size, which was a goal of post-war U.S. policy. Anyone in this back half of the room can form a line at the mic there. I'll go Fred, Katie, and Richard.
I want to pick up on this very last comment that Jeff Frieden just made and point out that an unspoken tacit assumption that we all make in these discussions about a dollar-based system is that the United States will want to continue playing the role of the hegemon or the center country. If you take Jeff's earlier analysis just somewhat of an extreme, you might say, suppose that didn't continue. As Maury pointed out in detail this morning, the US went rogue under Nixon and caused a huge break in the system, which I argued yesterday, I think most agree, at the end of the day led to a positive outcome. But the US went rogue. Under Trump 1, the US definitely went rogue, particularly on the trade system side. So suppose down the road, the US decided, like Bob Oliver was saying yesterday, that being the center country is not such a good idea for the US. And therefore, the US no longer wanted to play the role of the center country. And it raises at least two huge questions. Suppose the US wanted to get out of the center role, how could it do it? And secondly, of course, how would the rest of the world have to adjust to that? But in the kind of domestic political situation we find ourselves, as Jeff outlined and just reiterated, I think those are questions that we maybe should begin thinking about. In a way, I'm adding it to Jeff Franco, your list of questions at the start. It's too late for this conference really to discuss it much, although I'd welcome any responses. But I think the supply side, so to speak, of the key currency system maybe needs to be thought about and not assumed to be forever in the way it has been in the past.
Sort of depends on whether the US can continue to get away with exploiting exorbitant privilege and yet the rest of the world remain willing to hold dollars, which so far seems to be the case.
Yeah, except if you think it's not an exorbitant privilege, but an exorbitant burden, which many people increasingly do, then the whole cost benefit becomes changed.
Let's go to Katie Russ.
So on that note, with the unlimited willingness to suppress consumption among surplus countries.
Speak into the mic, please.
Among surplus countries, I'm curious because sometimes they just say that we're profligate and our lack of willingness to suppress consumption is causing our own problems. And so I wondered what you might think about that. And then also the seemingly unlimited appetite for safe assets. People here are becoming concerned about that insofar as they're figuring out that their kids and grandkids are going to have to pay off the safe assets in the future. And so their response is to threaten default and with some focus on foreign countries. I mean, that's been mentioned since I was a kid in Southwest Virginia growing up, but now it's becoming closer and closer to reality. So I wondered what your thoughts were on that as well. And then just to link a little bit of a fact in Linda's discussion to Andres' discussion or his presentation earlier, it did look like very few countries are receiving these swap lines. I don't know if that's because they're not qualified, and I wondered if the FEMA was intended to generalize that liquidity to get around that kind of thing, or if there's any hope in the future that more countries might somehow become qualified for swap lines. Thanks.
So I'll ask panelists to respond to either of the two questioners, speakers that have come so far, and then we'll go to Randy and Ted. Jeff, who do you want to respond to?
Yeah, I agree with Fred in flagging this issue. I would point out in the context of what Hélène, the way Hélène motivated her talk, that when Charlie Kindleberger wrote about this in 1976, what he wrote about first was the collapse of the British-led system, and that it's the conclusion of the 1976, which was the history of the Great Depression. That was what the book was about. And it blamed the Great Depression on the fact that after World War I, Britain was no longer able and the US was not willing to act in that hegemonic role. So in a way, what goes around comes around. We're now wondering whether there's a willing hegemon out there, if you want to think of it along those terms. Katie, I'll leave it to others to contemplate, but Katie, I think these are crucially important questions in a sense. If we look at the global imbalances, whatever you think about their implications, essentially we've got a high savings, low consumption equilibrium in the surplus countries and a high consumption, low savings equilibrium in the US. Those seem to be stable for now. And the question is, are they dynamically stable? That is, can they be sustained over time? And that I think is a fundamental question for the international economic system, not just monetary.
So there are 5 countries that have standing swap lines with the Fed, and there are 9 with temporary swap lines. And then there is a much larger group of countries that have these FEMA accounts set up. So that's a much larger group. I wanted to say something on the questions that Jeff posed in the very beginning, just 2 small comments. You asked what currencies are potential challengers to the dollar, and you mentioned Barry Eichengreen's work, and Eswar mentioned that yesterday. The smaller currencies that have risen, I think a lot of that, and they argue in that paper as well, is about portfolio management. So it's less about reserve currency status than getting returns in a low interest rate period. And you also mentioned about gold. And I just want to say relative to the size of overall portfolios, that's still not very large.
Yan Liang.
Maybe to, Fred's question, think about the supply or demand of public goods. Basically, I think the international currency or dominant reserve currency is a public good, right? And yesterday, we have a discussion on euro 85. I remember this, I think, it's on my reading list. I remember, I went back to check out on the Peterson website, euro 85. I remember that time, the overall message was actually very positive. So, things happen, we've seen a lot of things happen since in the past 15 years. I mentioned in the beginning, the renminbi float since 2018 is also, the floating at 5. So I think there's a lot of promises, but a lot of challenges. And then for the international public goods, the dominant currency play a very important role. And I think at this stage, probably for the foreseeable future, we still rely on, on one currency to play, a public goods role. I think that's, the threat is that, the increasing weaponization of public goods or international infrastructure. That's what's worrisome.
Hey, I've just been told we have to end at 12:30 sharp, which is less than 10 minutes. So keep the answers very brief, and then we'll take all the remaining 3 questions at once. You're allowed to pass.
Okay, so the US willing hegemon. So I do think that actually there's a reason why we talk about privilege is that there are a number of benefits which are not trivial, whom several got mentioned. So there's the success return, there's the adjustment mechanism, there's the ability to refinance, there's simply the business aspects of things also. It goes together with the developed breadth of financial markets, depth, etc., which support business activities in various ways. And I do see that there are other powers. It goes with geopolitical powers, for the extra jurisdictionality of the dollar, etc. So there are lots of attributes that, in my view, are very hard to would be very hard to give up for the US. But I also see that there are some rivals. So I do think that China has been making some steps in order to internationalize the RMB. I'm sure there will be a little bit of an upward use of the RMB in terms of means of payment, international medium of exchange, via invoicing, via payment systems. I mean, China has a bargaining power with its trying to build a regional dominance, has bargaining power when it does trade, etc. So there will be an increased use of the RMB, but it will fall very much short in terms of the financial side. Unless there are very, very consequential structural reforms which are done. So I'm not seeing an exit of the current situation. Yes, let's leave it at that.
So we're very short on time now. All right, let us take, and just make it questions, no comments. Richard, I said, could go next.
A quick question for Jeff, and that is the tension between domestic politics and international collaboration. Can you comment on that in the Eurozone context? A quick question for either Linda or Hyun. In the turmoil of the past couple of weeks, have we seen any rise in the covered interest parity differential? Have we seen any drawings on swap agreements? That is to say, have the market tensions been manifested in one or the other or both ways?
Okay, thank you. Randy Henning.
So thank you, Jeff. My quick question is for Ellen Ray, and anyone else who wants to address it. And that relates to the multipolarity solution that you highlighted. And you said that for this to work, there had to be other countries that had broad, deep, liquid, transparent financial markets and were willing to provide safe assets in a crisis. So as you just mentioned, China is not going to be any one of these countries anytime soon. The question is, what would it take for the Euro area to become this country, or to become this alternative pole? So is it capital markets union? Is it banking union? Is it fiscal union, or some combination of the above?
And Ted Truman.
I've been inclined to defer to the finance ministry, but okay. So for Jeff, hasn't it always been the case that the United States has responded to a global challenge that it is perceived to be in its own interest? So the question is whether that perception will be perceived by the authorities, if you want to put it that way, and accepted by the populace. I think that's the question. And one second aspect of it, which is for Linda, that she may not want to, others might want to comment on, you can interpret what's gone on with the swaps over time as they got set up temporarily, then they were made permanent, then some were made permanent, unlimited, and then another set were on and off, right? And then in the FEMA situation, FEMA was set up so that was an extension of the swap, right? And so but as the world changes, the next question that the Federal Reserve is going to have, and maybe domestic politics too, is whether the other countries should be qualified in some sense for the swaps. You probably don't want to answer that, but I think that's the question. The third question, which is for all of
that's enough.
No. Well, then this is probably more. Let them ignore the first three and answer this, which is, what if Congress should say no more swaps? What would happen to the international monetary system?
So we have 2 minutes left, exactly. That means I can't take any more questions. At least 24 seconds for each of the panelists to comment if they want to comment.
Okay. So I think the question of whether the burden is accepted by any country, by the Eurozone as a bloc or individual countries within it and in the United States, is the perception of whether there are benefits. Now, saying that there are exorbitant privileges is right when we look at the country, but to whom those privileges accrue. And so the domestic politics of this is all about where the benefits fall. And we saw that during the debate over the bailouts in the 1990s. Very easy to predict who was going to be in favor of extending credit to the troubled debtors and who was going to be opposed. So these issues are decided not by the country, they're decided within a country that has highly differentiated distributional preferences and interests.
Linda.
Richard, yes. Yes, action in swap spreads. Yesterday, the H41 data was released by the Fed that reports kind of facility use in aggregate. 60 billion was reported yesterday in the data. For TED, you asked if the FEMA repo are an extension of swap lines. They are not an extension of swap lines. They are which have very different terms on them and very different kind of uses. They are an extension of dollar liquidity.
Yan Liang. Pass. Helene.
For the euro, so all that you mentioned, but especially one thing, which is that in times of stress, we still have divergence and capital flight within the euro area towards the Bund out of countries considered more risky, which would spread pressure on the banking system in particular. So with the bank doom loop, and we cannot have that. We have to have resiliency in times of stress, and there are several ways to get there: banking union, capital market union, and safe asset.
And Song.
Actually, Linda just said what I was going to say in answer to Richard. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry we don't have time for any more of the questions, but join me in thanking the panel for doing a good job of concluding our session.
No, that's great. Yeah. Our panelists can step down.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So while we're transitioning here, I just wanted to end on 3 notes quickly, if I can. First of all, we've operated at this conference under the tyranny of alphabetical order. That's been the order of speakers. That was the order of the conference organizers on the program. But I just want to say that that alphabetical order doesn't indicate importance. Thanks to Adam Posen for having this conference, and particularly the meeting group headed by Jessica for setting up the arrangements and allowing us to do this. Thanks also to Maurice Obstfeld for the intellectual input and the energy to get everyone together and bring this off. So I just wanted to offer those thanks. We've covered so many different topics in so many different areas over the past day and a half, mainly financial, mainly macroeconomic. And I just want to take one moment to highlight one aspect of this question of what happened in March 1973 that we haven't discussed so much, and that's the trading system, because that's been an important part of the work here at the Institute, an important part of how we think about international economics. So when we go back and think about, whoops, I can go forward, one more slide. Why did we set up the Bretton Woods system in the first place? Why did we set up a system of fixed but adjustable exchange rates? Just look at the Articles of Agreement for both the World Bank and the IMF. It's international trade. It wasn't to promote even macroeconomic stability, certainly full employment. It wasn't to promote international financial integration. The trading system was central to what they wanted to achieve, and stability was thought to foster that stability. So when we transitioned to flexible exchange rates in 1973, we were entering a new world. What were the implications for trade? There were 2 major fears at the time. One is that exchange rate fluctuations, this new world, would depress trade, create uncertainty, make it difficult to have these transactions take place. Then there's also the question of how flexible exchange rate or the regime would affect trade policy per se. So on the first one, Joe Gagnon's done some work on this back at the Fed. There are more recent reviews, and I think most people in the room probably know there has not been a lot of evidence that fluctuating exchange rates have had a depressing effect or have deterred trade in any significant degree. There's hedging, there's a lot of ways around it. And so that fear was largely unrealized after 1973. So what about how would flexible exchange rates affect trade policy? Now, this is an interesting one because if we go back to, and there's a lot of uncertainty about it, could go either way. We go back to Milton Friedman, who's been referred to many times here over the past day and a half, his original essay, paragraph 2 says why he thought we need to move to a more flexible exchange rate regime. And he said, it's absolutely essential for the fulfillment of our basic economic objective, the achievement and maintenance of a free and prosperous world community engaging in unrestricted multilateral trade. That's just reflecting what the Bretton Woods institutions had written into their Articles of Agreement. But why did he believe this? What was the problem with the Bretton Woods system as he outlined here? The problem was, as a result of the Great Depression and the exchange controls and the rationing of foreign exchange, that import controls were being imposed for balance of payments purposes. I know we trade economists, we like to think, well, it's protectionist pressures coming from industry, but going into the post-war period, import controls were imposed for balance of payments purposes. Unless you allowed the exchange rate to move to adjust international payments, you were forced either to deflate, which no one wanted to do because that would compromise the objective of full employment, or you had to impose trade controls to mitigate your spending on imports to conserve those scarce foreign exchange reserves. And that was the regime that he wanted to get rid of by moving to exchange rates. What happened? Well, we talked about this earlier today in the panel and yesterday too. Developing countries came late to the idea of flexible exchange rates in the 1980s and into the 1990s. That coincides with a great wave of trade reform in the developing world as India opens up, as Chile opened up very early in the 70s, as other countries followed, China too. They adopted more flexible exchange rate regimes that allowed them to get rid of those import controls for balance of payments purposes and freed them up to get rid of those import controls. And as a result, what is perhaps surprising to those in 1973 was moving to more flexible exchange rates allowed the hyper-globalization, if you will, not just in the financial space, but in the trade space as well. Tariffs came down. You no longer use trade policy for balance of payments purposes. So of course, there's no free lunch. So the first line here is more flexible exchange rates allow the removal of import controls imposed for balance of payments purposes. The IMF played a major role in trying to push countries exactly in this direction, which is why Ann Kruger yesterday quoted Ernst Sturck saying, you know, Bretton Woods was designed to fix exchange rates, and he spent his career at the IMF trying to convince countries to devalue. But of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's always a counterbalancing problem, and the problem is real exchange rate fluctuations can lead to sectoral protectionism in the form of temporary trade barriers. This has been the work of Peterson, and before that, the Institute for International Economics for many years. I'll just point to one among many works by Fred Bergston and John Williamson. In this case, a prescient piece noting the impact, the relationship between exchange rates and trade policy, and the potential problems that come about as a result of fluctuations. And Chad Bown has continued this by pointing out during the Great Recession, we saw a rise in anti-dumping and countervailing duties when countries resisted movements in their exchange rate. So this interaction between the exchange rate regime and trade policy is still very much with it. Last remark is directed to the panelists and also the session chairs. We invite you to write up your remarks, and we're willing to help you with that because we have videos, but we would love to receive, Maureen and I would love to receive 10 to 15 pages, say, writing up your remarks, perhaps in the next month, if that is feasible. And once again, let me reiterate that we open this to the panel session leaders as well, if you want to write something up. Obviously not mandatory, but we'd really like to put this together. And so just feel free to contact us with any questions. But I just want to close by thanking all the panelists, all the participants, everyone in the audience for a great day and a half. Very interesting to Maureen and myself, and we hope you as well. Thank you for coming.